Hey, and thanks for tuning in to Cheating Tales Lab. We've got another awesome story for you, and we hope you enjoy every moment. So, let's jump into the story and get things rolling. Jack Reeves fumbled with his keys, the exhaustion from his 36-hour shift making even this simple task a challenge. As the lock finally gave way, he stumbled into the quiet of his home. The silence was a stark contrast to the chaos of the emergency room he'd left behind. He leaned against the closed door, eyes shut, reliving the day's triumphs. Mrs. Johnson's heart transplant had been successful. Little Timmy would walk again after that nasty car accident. Jack allowed himself a small smile. Days like these made the long hours worth it. Opening his eyes, he surveyed the dim entryway. His gaze fell on his daughter's backpack, carelessly tossed on the floor. A fond sigh escaped his lips. "Emily," he muttered, shaking his head, "when will you learn to hang this up?" He bent to pick up the bag, wincing as his back protested the movement. As he lifted it, intending to hang it on its designated hook, a small leather-bound book slipped out and hit the floor with a soft thud. Jack froze, recognizing it instantly. Emily's diary. He stared at it, warring with himself. The Scout law, ingrained in him since childhood, echoed in his mind. Trustworthy. Loyal. "I shouldn't," he whispered to the empty house. Yet even as the words left his mouth, his hand was reaching for the book. Something nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite place. Call it doctor's intuition, but something felt off. With trembling fingers, he flipped open the diary. His eyes scanned the pages, not really reading at first, just taking in his daughter's neat handwriting. Then, a phrase caught his attention, making his blood run cold. "And then second dad took me to the science fair. He was so proud when I won first place. I wish dad could have been there, but I know the hospital keeps him busy." Jack read the passage again and again. Each time, the words "second dad" seemed to grow larger, mocking him. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. His mind raced, flipping through possibilities. A grandfather? An uncle? But no, Emily would have used those terms. This was something else. Something deliberate. He turned more pages, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. More references to this mysterious figure leapt out at him. "Second dad helped me with my math homework. Second dad took me for ice cream after my dentist appointment." Jack's hands were shaking now, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. How long had this been going on? How had he not noticed? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped him back to reality. He snapped the diary shut, his decision made. No more secrets. No more lies. It was time for answers. Sarah's key turned in the lock, and Jack straightened, squaring his shoulders. The diary felt heavy in his hand, a damning piece of evidence. The door swung open, and Sarah walked in, her face brightening at the sight of him. "Jack, you're home early," her smile faltered as she took in his expression, her eyes flicking to the diary in his hand. The color drained from her face. "We need to talk," Jack said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Sarah's bag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the floor with a thud. "Jack, I can explain." "Can you?" Jack cut her off, his tone eerily calm. He held up the diary. "Who is second dad? Sarah?" Sarah's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. She looked like a fish out of water, gasping for air. "What I think," Jack continued, his calm exterior belying the turmoil within, "is that my daughter has been calling another man dad behind my back. What I think is that my wife has been lying to me. Am I wrong, Sarah?" Sarah's shoulders slumped, defeat written in every line of her body. "His name is Alan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Dr. Alan Blackwood. He was my professor in college." Jack felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The room spun around him, and he had to lean against the wall to steady himself. "How long?" he managed to ask, dreading the answer. Sarah's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. 10 years. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. A decade. A whole decade of lies and betrayal. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say in the face of such a betrayal? Sarah took a step toward him, her hand outstretched. Jack, please, let me explain. It's not what you think. Jack jerked away from her touch as if it burned. Not what I think, he spat, his calm finally cracking. What exactly am I supposed to think, Sarah? That you've been having an innocent tea party with your old professor for the last 10 years? That you just happened to forget to mention it? Sarah flinched at his words. I never meant for it to go this far. It just happened. Happened. Jack's laugh was bitter. Things like this don't just happen, Sarah. You made a choice. Every time you met him, every time you lied to me, every time you let our daughter call him Dad, you made a choice. The sound of the front door opening again cut through the tension. Margaret, Jack's mother, walked in, her arms full of groceries. Her smile froze as she took in the scene before her. Jack? Sarah? What's going on? Margaret asked, her eyes darting between them. Jack turned to his mother, ready to explain, when he caught the flicker of guilt that crossed her face. His eyes narrowed. You knew, he said, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. Margaret set the groceries down, her hands trembling slightly. Jack, please, let me explain. Explain what, Mom? Jack's voice rose, filling the small entryway. Explain that you've been covering for Sarah's affair? That you've been lying to me too? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak. Jack's laugh was hollow, devoid of any humor. How long have you known? I found out a few years ago, Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I kept quiet to protect the family. I thought if I ignored it, it might go away. Jack shook his head, disgust evident in his expression. Protect the family? By lying to me? By letting my daughter call another man Dad? Sarah stepped forward, reaching out to Jack again. Please, Jack, let's talk about this. I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through this. For Emily's sake, if nothing else. Jack jerked away from her touch once more. Mistakes? A decade-long affair isn't a mistake, Sarah. It's a choice. A choice you made every single day for 10 years. He turned to Margaret. And you're supposed to be my mother. How could you keep this from me? Margaret's tears were flowing freely now. I'm so sorry, Jack. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't want to see our family torn apart. Well, congratulations, Mom, Jack said bitterly. You've succeeded spectacularly. Our family isn't torn apart. It's obliterated. With that, he pushed past them both, heading for the stairs. He needed to be alone, to process this betrayal that seemed to infect every aspect of his life. Jack, wait. Sarah called after him. Where are you going? We need to talk about this. Jack paused on the stairs, not turning back. I'm going to check on our daughter. The one person in this house who hasn't been lying to me for years. His voice was cold, detached. Don't follow me. I can't even look at either of you right now. As he climbed the stairs, he could hear Sarah's muffled sobs and his mother's attempts at consolation. But he felt nothing. The shock was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. He didn't know if he'd ever be able to feel anything for them again. In the days that followed, Jack's world crumbled around him. He threw himself into his work, performing back-to-back surgeries with laser-like focus. The operating room became his sanctuary, the one place where the chaos in his personal life couldn't touch him. His colleagues noticed the change in him. The usual warmth in his eyes was replaced by a steely determination. His easy smile was now a line of concentration, but they attributed it to his legendary dedication, not knowing the turmoil that lay beneath the surface. Dr. Thompson, the head of surgery, stopped him in the hallway after his third consecutive shift. Jack, you've been here for 72 hours straight. Go home, get some rest. Jack's smile didn't reach his eyes as he replied, I'm fine, sir. There's always more work to be done. Dr. Thompson frowned, concern etching lines on his forehead. Jack, I admire your dedication, but you're no good to your patients if you're exhausted. Take a break. That's an order. Jack nodded, knowing he couldn't argue. But the thought of going home filled him with dread. Home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. As he drove home, his mind wandered to the confrontations that awaited him. Sarah had been trying to corner him for days, attempting to explain, to justify her actions. But how could anyone justify a decade of lies? He pulled into the driveway, steeling himself for what was to come. As soon as he stepped through the door, Sarah was there, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Jack, please," she began, her voice hoarse. "We need to talk about this. I know what I did was wrong, but you have to understand. Your work, you were always at the hospital. I felt so alone." Jack's eyes were cold as he looked at her. "So you decided to sleep with your professor? To let him play daddy to our daughter? Tell me, Sarah, how exactly am I supposed to understand that?" Sarah flinched at his words. "I never meant for it to go this far. It just happened. Alan was there when you weren't. He listened, he cared, and I didn't." Jack interrupted, his voice rising. "I was saving lives, Sarah. I was working to provide for our family. And all this time, you were, what? Playing happy families with your lover?" Sarah's face crumpled. "It wasn't like that, Jack. I love you. I've always loved you. Alan he was a mistake. A horrible, terrible mistake." Jack shook his head, disgust evident in his expression. "A mistake is forgetting to buy milk, Sarah. A mistake is being late for a dinner reservation. What you did, that's not a mistake. That's a choice. A choice you made every day for 10 years. He pushed past her, heading for the stairs. He needed to see Emily, the one person in this house who hadn't betrayed him. He found Emily sitting alone in her room, her eyes red from crying. His heart broke at the sight. In all the chaos, he hadn't stopped to think how this was affecting her. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, sitting next to her on the bed. "How are you holding up?" Emily's lower lip trembled. "Is this my fault, Dad? Because I wrote about him in my diary?" Jack pulled her into a tight hug, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. "No, absolutely not. None of this is your fault, Emily. You hear me? This is about choices that adults made, not you." Emily clung to him, her small body shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to call him Dad," he said. "He said it would make Mom happy." Jack's jaw clenched at her words, but he kept his voice gentle. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Emily. You did nothing wrong. The adults in your life, we're the ones who messed up. But I promise you, we're going to fix this. Somehow." As Emily's sobs subsided, Jack felt a renewed sense of determination. He would get through this, for her sake if nothing else. He might not know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to protect his daughter from the fallout of this betrayal. That evening, as Jack sat in his study, trying to make sense of the chaos his life had become, his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him to answer. "Hello? Jack? This is Alan Blackwood." Jack's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles turning white. The voice on the other end was smooth, almost condescending. It took every ounce of Jack's self-control not to hang up immediately. "What do you want?" he managed to grit out. "I think it's time we discuss this situation like gentlemen, don't you?" Blackwood's tone was infuriatingly calm, as if they were discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. Jack's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. "Fine," he spat out. "Name the time and place." As he hung up, Jack's mind was already formulating a plan. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Blackwood might think he had the upper hand, but Jack was just getting started. He would protect his daughter, salvage what was left of his family, and make sure Blackwood paid for his part in this betrayal. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he never thought he'd have to face. But Jack Reeves was no stranger to adversity. He'd fought to save lives in the operating room, against impossible odds. Now, he would fight for his family, for his daughter, for his very sense of self. As he looked out the window at the setting sun, Jack felt a strange calm settle over him. The storm of emotions that had been raging inside him for days quieted, replaced by a steely resolve. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. He was Dr. Jack Reeves, and he didn't back down from a fight. The ambulance sirens pierced the night, their urgent wails growing louder as they approached County General Hospital. Dr. Jack Reeves stood at the emergency room entrance, his face a mask of determination. The call had come in 15 minutes ago, A devastating multi-car pileup on the highway. Multiple critical injuries. All hands on deck. As the first ambulance screeched to a halt, Jack's mind snapped into focus. The chaos of his personal life faded into the background. Here, in this moment, he was Dr. Reeves, trauma surgeon. Nothing else mattered. What have we got? Jack barked as the EMTs rushed the first stretcher towards him. Male, mid-30s, severe head trauma and possible internal bleeding. One of the EMTs rattled off. BP's dropping fast. Jack's hands were already moving, assessing the patient as they wheeled him inside. Get him 2 or 3. Page Dr. Sanderson for neuroconsult. Move. For the next several hours, Jack was a whirlwind of activity. He moved from one critical patient to another, barking orders, performing intricate surgeries, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. In or two, elbow deep in a patient's chest cavity, Jack felt a bead of sweat trickle down his forehead. Suction, he commanded, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. We've got a bleeder here. As he worked to repair the torn aorta, Jack's mind flashed briefly to Sarah, to the betrayal that had shattered his world. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. He couldn't save his marriage, but he could save this life. Hours blended together as Jack moved from one emergency to the next. He was vaguely aware of the nurses murmuring in awe at his stamina, his laser-like focus. Let them talk. This was what he was born to do. As the crisis began to subside, Jack stepped out of the OR, peeling off his bloody gloves. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the ache of exhaustion setting in. But there was no time to rest. More patients needed him. He was heading towards the next, or when he spotted a familiar figure in the hallway. His steps faltered as he recognized Dr. Alan Blackwood, the man who had been playing second dad to his daughter for years. Blackwood was standing with another doctor, engaged in what appeared to be a casual conversation, as if he hadn't torn apart a family, as if he had every right to be here. Their eyes met across the bustling ER. Blackwood's lips curled into a smirk, a look of smug superiority that made Jack's blood boil. Jack's hands clenched at his sides, the urge to wipe that smirk off Blackwood's face with his fist nearly overwhelming. For a moment, Jack saw red. He imagined striding across the room, grabbing Blackwood by his expensive collar, and slamming him against the wall. He could almost feel the satisfying crunch of the man's nose breaking under his fist. But then a nurse's voice cut through his violent fantasy. Dr. Reeves, we need you in or 4. It's critical. Jack blinked, the red haze receding. He took a deep breath, unclenching his fists. With a last, cold look at Blackwood, he turned and strode towards or 4. He had lives to save. Blackwood could wait. As Jack scrubbed in for yet another surgery, he forced himself to focus. Push away the anger, the betrayal, the hurt. Channel it all into saving lives. That's what he did best. That's what he could control. Hours later, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, Jack finally emerged from the OR. The crisis was over. They had lost 2 patients, but saved many more. It was a victory, albeit a bittersweet one. As he headed towards the locker room, dead on his feet, a voice called out to him. Dr. Reeves? A word, please. Jack turned to see Dr. Harrison, the hospital administrator, beckoning him into his office. With a weary nod, Jack followed him in. Remarkable work tonight, Jack, Dr. Harrison began, his tone grave despite the praise. You saved a lot of lives. Just doing my job, Jack replied, too tired for false modesty. About that, Dr. Harrison continued, his expression turning grim. I'm afraid I have some bad news. The board has decided that due to budget cuts, we need to eliminate 1 senior surgeon position. Jack felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. After everything he'd been through, after the hell of the past few days, now this? I see, he said, his voice carefully neutral. And I suppose I'm on the chopping block? Dr. Harrison spread his hands in a helpless gesture. Nothing's been decided yet, but I wanted to give you a heads up. The board will be reviewing all senior staff over the next week. I suggest you prepare to defend your position. Jack nodded, his mind already racing. He'd have to fight to keep his job, all while his personal life was in shambles. But he was Dr. Jack Reeves. He didn't back down from a fight. "Thank you for letting me know," he said, standing up. "If there's nothing else?" As he left Dr. Harrison's office, Jack's exhaustion was tinged with a new determination. He'd been backed into a corner, both personally and professionally. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Not by a long shot. The park was quiet in the early evening, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the carefully manicured lawns. Jack Reeves sat on a bench, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the path. He checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes. Blackwood was late. Typical. As if summoned by Jack's impatience, a figure appeared on the path. Dr. Alan Blackwood strolled towards the bench, his silver hair catching the last rays of sunlight. His walk was unhurried, almost leisurely, as if he were out for an evening constitutional rather than a confrontation. Jack's jaw clenched as Blackwood approached. The man's casual demeanor, his air of smug superiority, made Jack's blood boil. But he forced himself to remain seated, to maintain his outward calm. He wouldn't give Blackwood the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "Jack, my boy," Blackwood said as he reached the bench, his tone infuriatingly patronizing. "So good of you to meet me here. Lovely evening, isn't it?" Jack didn't respond, merely gestured for Blackwood to sit. The older man lowered himself onto the bench, arranging his expensive coat around him with fastidious care. "Now then," Blackwood began, a condescending smile playing on his lips. "I think it's time we discuss this situation like gentlemen. Don't you agree?" Jack remained silent, his eyes fixed on Blackwood's face. Let the bastard talk. Let him dig his own grave. Blackwood, seemingly unperturbed by Jack's silence, continued. "I understand you're upset. It's a natural reaction. But I think, if you look at this objectively, you'll see that there's a way for all of us to benefit from this situation." Jack's eyebrow raised slightly, the only outward sign of his incredulity. Benefit? From his wife's infidelity? From the betrayal of his family? He was curious to see how Blackwood would spin this. "You see," Blackwood went on, warming to his theme, "Sarah and Emily, they need me. I've been a part of their lives for so long now. And you, Jack, well, let's be honest. Your work keeps you away so much. They need a stable presence in their lives." Jack's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the effort of restraining himself. "But still," he said nothing. "What I'm proposing," Blackwood said, leaning in conspiratorially, "is an arrangement. I continue to see Sarah and Emily. I can be there for them when you can't. Think of it as a support system. For your family." The audacity of the suggestion nearly took Jack's breath away. For a moment, he was speechless with rage. But then, something shifted inside him. A cold, clear anger replaced the hot fury that had been burning in his chest. When Jack finally spoke, his voice was soft, but there was steel beneath the quiet tone. "An arrangement," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's an interesting proposal, Alan. May I call you Alan?" Blackwood nodded, a look of relief crossing his face. He clearly thought Jack was coming around to his way of thinking. "Let me counter with an arrangement of my own," Jack continued, his voice still dangerously soft. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk away. From Sarah, from Emily, from my family. You're going to disappear from our lives so completely it'll be like you never existed." Blackwood's smug smile faltered. "Now, Jack, be reasonable." "I'm not finished," Jack cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "If you don't, I will destroy you. I will report you to the University Ethics Board. I will provide evidence of your inappropriate relationship with a student. Yes, Alan, I have evidence. And I will ensure that your academic career ends in disgrace." The color drained from Blackwood's face as Jack laid out his plan in excruciating detail. The older man's arrogance crumbled, replaced by a look of dawning horror as he realized the precariousness of his position. "You can't," Blackwood began, but Jack cut him off again. "I can, and I will, unless you do exactly as I say." Blackwood's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. He looked like a fish out of water, gasping for air. But what about Sarah? What about Emily?" Blackwood finally managed to sputter. "They need me." Jack stood up, looming over the seated man. What they need, he said, his voice cold, is for you to disappear. You've done enough damage. It's time for you to go. With that, Jack turned and walked away, leaving Blackwood sputtering threats and pleas behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew he'd won this round. As he strode out of the park, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since discovering Sarah's betrayal, he felt in control. Blackwood had thought he held all the cards, but Jack had just shown him how wrong he was. Now, it was time to turn his attention to the next battle. His job at the hospital was on the line, and he'd be damned if he was going to lose that too. With renewed determination, Jack headed home to prepare for the fight ahead. The conference room was silent as Jack Reeves stepped up to the podium. The review board members sat in a semicircle before him, their faces impassive. Jack could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken pressure of what was at stake. He took a deep breath, centering himself. He'd spent the last week preparing for this moment, poring over hospital records, analyzing efficiency reports, crafting a plan that would not only save his job but revolutionize the ER. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, Jack began, his voice steady and confident. I stand before you today not just to defend my position, but to present a vision for the future of our emergency room. As Jack launched into his presentation, he could see the board members' expressions shift from polite interest to genuine engagement. He laid out his comprehensive plan to improve ER efficiency and reduce costs, his words painting a picture of a streamlined, cutting-edge emergency department that would set new standards in patient care. By implementing these changes, Jack continued, clicking through his meticulously prepared slides, we can reduce wait times by 30%, increase patient satisfaction by 25%, and most importantly, save more lives. He saw Dr. Harrison, the hospital administrator, lean forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. The other board members were scribbling notes, nodding along with Jack's points. As Jack neared the end of his presentation, he felt a surge of confidence. He'd given them something to think about, something that went beyond simply justifying his own position. He was offering them a way to transform the entire emergency department. In conclusion, Jack said, his voice ringing with conviction, I believe that by adopting these measures, we can not only weather the current budget crisis but emerge stronger, more efficient, and better equipped to serve our community. Thank you. As Jack finished speaking, a murmur of discussion broke out among the board members. Dr. Harrison opened his mouth, presumably to begin the questioning phase of the review, when suddenly, a shrill alarm cut through the air. Code blue in the ER. A voice announced over the intercom. Code blue in the ER. Without hesitation, Jack turned to the board. I apologize, but I'm needed downstairs. Lives are at stake. Before anyone could object, Jack was out the door, racing towards the emergency room. As he ran, he could hear footsteps behind him. The board members were following. Jack burst into the ER to find chaos. A patient on a gurney was convulsing, surrounded by frantic nurses. What's the situation? Jack barked, already moving towards the patient. Male, 50s, cardiac arrest, a nurse reported. We've been doing CPR for 10 minutes. No response. Jack's mind kicked into high gear, assessing the situation in seconds. Get me the defibrillator, he ordered. Already starting chest compressions. Push one of AP. As he worked, Jack was vaguely aware of the board members watching from the doorway. But his focus was entirely on the patient. Nothing else mattered. Clear. Jack called, applying the defibrillator paddles. The patient's body jerked with the shock, but the heart monitor continued its ominous flat line. Again, Jack commanded, resuming compressions. Come on, don't give up on me now. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Jack's arms ached from the constant compressions, sweat beading on his forehead. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Clear. He called again, delivering another shock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, miraculously, a beep. Then another. The heart monitor sprang to life, showing a weak but steady rhythm. We've got a pulse, Jack announced, his voice hoarse with exertion and relief. Get him to the ICU, Stat. As the nurses wheeled the patient away, Jack finally allowed himself to breathe. He turned to find the entire review board staring at him, their expressions a mix of awe and respect. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, a smile breaking across his usually stern face. "Dr. Reeves," he said, "I think we've seen all we need to see. Your position is safe. In fact, if you're amenable, we'd like to offer you the position of head of emergency surgery." Jack blinked, the words taking a moment to register through his post-adrenaline haze. Thank you, sir," he managed to say. "I'd be honored." As the news spread through the hospital, Jack found himself surrounded by congratulating colleagues. Nurses patted him on the back. Fellow doctors shook his hand. In that moment, Jack felt a surge of pride and accomplishment that he hadn't experienced in a long time. But even as he accepted the congratulations, a part of Jack's mind was already moving forward. He had secured his professional future, yes, but there was still work to be done. His personal life was still in shambles, and he had no intention of letting Blackwood or Sarah off the hook. As he headed to his office to change out of his sweat-soaked scrubs, Jack's mind was already formulating his next move. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over, and Jack Reeves was just getting started. Jack Reeves sat in his dimly lit study, surrounded by stacks of papers and file folders. The soft glow of his laptop screen illuminated his face, casting shadows that accentuated the lines of exhaustion etched there. He rubbed his eyes, bleary from hours of poring over financial records and emails. It had been 3 weeks since his confrontation with Blackwood in the park. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days. But Jack was nothing if not methodical. He would build his case brick by brick, leaving no stone unturned. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he'd come to know by heart. Daniel's Investigations. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "It's Reeves," Jack said, his voice low. "Any updates?" "Yeah, Doc. Got some juicy stuff for you. Your wife and the professor met again yesterday. Got it all on camera this time." Jack's jaw clenched. Even after everything, even after he'd made it clear to Blackwood to stay away, they were still seeing each other. "Send me everything," he said, his tone clipped. As he hung up, Jack's eyes fell on a framed photo on his desk. It was from happier times. Him, Sarah, and Emily at the beach, all smiles and sunburned noses. He turned the frame face down with a heavy sigh. Turning back to his laptop, Jack pulled up the financial records he'd been combing through. Credit card statements, bank transfers, even receipts Sarah had carelessly left lying around. It was all there in black and white, years of misused family funds, funneled into supporting her affair with Blackwood. A hotel room here, an expensive dinner there. Gifts that Jack now realized were never for him. It made him sick to his stomach. But it wasn't just about the money. Jack had been reaching out to Blackwood's former students, carefully and discreetly. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Blackwood had a history of inappropriate relationships with students, stretching back years. He'd just been clever enough to keep it quiet. Until now. A knock at the study door startled Jack from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, hastily minimizing the windows on his screen. Emily poked her head in, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Jack's heart clenched. In his laser focus on building his case, had he been neglecting his daughter? "Of course, sweetheart. Come here." Emily shuffled in, curling up in the armchair across from Jack's desk. She looked small, vulnerable. Jack waited patiently for her to speak. Is Mom coming back?" Emily finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack sighed. How could he explain this to a child? "I don't know, Emily. Your mom and I. We have a lot to work through." Emily nodded, picking at a loose thread on her pajama sleeve. And Dr. Blackwood? Is he going to be my dad now?" The question hit Jack like a physical blow. He was around the desk in an instant, kneeling in front of Emily and taking her small hands in his. "Listen to me, Emily. I am your dad. The only dad you need. No one, not Dr. Blackwood, not anyone, is ever going to change that. Do you understand?" Emily nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jack pulled her into a tight hug, his own eyes stinging. As he held his daughter, he felt his resolve harden. He would see this through, not just for himself, but for Emily. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Jack found himself staring at his phone again. He scrolled through his contacts, finger hovering over a name he hadn't called in years. Mike Hawkins, his oldest friend, a detective with the police department. Before he could talk himself out of it, Jack hit the call button. Jack? Mike's voice was surprised but warm. It's been a while, buddy. Everything okay? Jack took a deep breath. Mike, I need your help. And I need a friend. Over the next hour, Jack poured out the whole sordid story. The affair, the betrayal, the evidence he'd been gathering. Mike listened in silence, only occasionally asking for clarification. When Jack finally finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jesus, Jack, Mike finally said. I had no idea. Why didn't you call me sooner? I don't know, Jack admitted. Pride, maybe. Shame. I needed to handle it on my own. Well, you're not alone anymore, Mike said firmly. Listen, what you're doing, building this case, it's smart, but you need to be careful. This Blackwood guy sounds like a real piece of work, and if he's as connected as you say, he could be dangerous. Jack nodded, even though Mike couldn't see him. I know. That's why I called you. I need advice, Mike. Legal advice, sure, but I also need to know I'm not crazy. That I'm doing the right thing here. You're not crazy, Jack, Mike assured him. And from where I'm sitting, you're handling this about as well as anyone could. But listen, you need to be prepared for how ugly this could get. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Jack's eyes fell on the face-down photo frame. For a moment, he saw Emily's tear-stained face in his mind. His jaw set. I'm sure, he said. I have to see this through. For Emily's sake, if nothing else. All right, Mike said. Then let's do this right. Here's what you need to do. As Mike laid out a plan of action, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. And with Mike's help, he would make sure that Blackwood and Sarah faced the consequences of their actions. The game was far from over, but Jack Reeves was finally ready to make his move. The conference room at the Hilton was uncomfortably quiet. Jack Reeves sat at the head of the long table, his face an impassive mask. To his right sat Mike Hawkins, a thick folder in front of him. Across from them, Sarah fidgeted nervously, her eyes darting between Jack and the door. The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch as the door opened. Alan Blackwood strode in, his silver hair immaculately styled, a confident smile on his face. That smile faltered as he took in the scene before him. What's going on here? Blackwood demanded, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Mike. Who's this? Please, have a seat. Alan, Jack said, his voice eerily calm. All will be explained shortly. As if on cue, the door opened again. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s entered, followed by a woman about Blackwood's age and a sharp-eyed man in an expensive suit. Dean Hartley, Jack said, nodding to the older man. Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Thompson. Thank you all for coming. Please, be seated. Blackwood's face had gone pale. Jack, what is the meaning of this? He sputtered. Jack leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. We're here to work things out, Alan. Isn't that what you wanted? To discuss our arrangement? Sarah's head snapped up at that, her eyes wide with panic. Alan, what is he talking about? Jack didn't give Blackwood a chance to respond. Let me explain, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. For the past decade, my wife Sarah has been carrying on an affair with Dr. Blackwood here. An affair that began when Sarah was his student. Dean Hartley's bushy eyebrows shot up. Mrs. Blackwood let out a small gasp. That's preposterous, Blackwood blustered. You have no proof. Oh, but I do. Jack cut him off smoothly. He nodded to Mike, who began laying out photos on the table. Photos of Sarah and Blackwood together, in various compromising positions. Hotel receipts, bank statements, financial records showing how my wife has been funneling our family's money to support this affair, Jack continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, and statements from several of Dr. Blackwood's former students, detailing a pattern of inappropriate relationships stretching back years. The color had drained from Blackwood's face. Sarah was openly weeping now, her head in her hands. This is a setup, Blackwood tried, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Jack asked mildly. He turned to Dean Hartley. Dean, I believe you'll find all the evidence you need here to conduct a full ethics inquiry. Mr. Thompson can advise you on the legal implications. The lawyer nodded, already leafing through the documents with a grim expression. Alan, Mrs. Blackwood spoke up, her voice trembling. Is this true? All of it? Blackwood opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Margaret, I can explain. But Jack wasn't done. Oh, there's more, he said, his eyes glinting. Sarah, would you like to explain to everyone how you've been embezzling funds from your research grant to pay for your little rendezvous? Sarah's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face a mask of horror. Jack, please, she begged. Don't do this. Do what, Sarah? Jack asked, his calm facade finally cracking. Tell the truth? Isn't that what you should have done years ago? The room descended into chaos. Blackwood and Sarah began shouting accusations at each other, their masks of civility finally shattering. Mrs. Blackwood dissolved into tears. Dean Hartley and Mr. Thompson huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers as they pored over the evidence. Through it all, Jack sat silent, watching the destruction he'd wrought. He felt no joy, no satisfaction, just a bone-deep weariness and a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was finally coming to an end. As the shouting reached a fever pitch, Mike leaned over to Jack. You okay, buddy? He asked quietly. Jack nodded, his eyes never leaving the scene before him. I will be, he said. Let's finish this. With that, Jack stood, silencing the room with his presence. I think we're done here, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Dean Hartley, Mr. Thompson, I trust you have what you need. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Sarah, he paused, meeting his wife's tear-filled eyes. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce proceedings. Without another word, Jack turned and walked out of the room, Mike close behind him. As the door closed, he could hear the chaos erupting again behind him. But for the first time in months, Jack felt a sense of peace. The trap had been sprung. Now, all that was left was to deal with the aftermath. The university auditorium was packed, a low murmur of voices filling the air. At the front, a panel of stern-faced administrators sat behind a long table, and in the center, looking small and defeated, sat Dr. Alan Blackwood. Jack Reeves watched from the back of the room, his face impassive. He debated whether to attend this ethics inquiry at all, but in the end, he felt he needed to see it through. To witness the final act of this sordid drama, the head of the ethics committee, a severe-looking woman with steel-gray hair, called the room to order. Dr. Blackwood, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed auditorium. You stand accused of multiple ethical violations, including inappropriate relationships with students and misuse of university resources. How do you plead? Blackwood, his once proud shoulders now slumped, barely raised his head. I cannot deny the charges, he said, his voice barely audible. A collective gasp went through the room. Jack felt a grim satisfaction. Blackwood had finally run out of lies. What followed was a thorough and damning presentation of evidence. Emails, witness statements, financial records. With each new revelation, Blackwood seemed to shrink further into himself. When it was over, the verdict was swift and unequivocal. Blackwood's tenure was revoked. His academic career lay in tatters. As security escorted him from the room, his eyes met Jack's for a brief moment. There was no anger there, no defiance, just a haunted, empty look that almost made Jack pity him. Almost. As Jack left the auditorium, his phone buzzed. A text from Mike. It's done. Sarah's out. Jack allowed himself a small smile. Sarah's own ethics inquiry at her research institute had concluded. Like Blackwood, she'd been found guilty of ethical violations and financial misconduct. Her career as a researcher was over. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings and court appearances. Jack's lawyer, armed with the mountain of evidence he'd gathered, presented an ironclad case for divorce. Sarah, her fight gone, barely contested it. The final hearing was mercifully brief. As the judge delivered her ruling, Jack felt a weight he'd been carrying for months finally lift from his shoulders. In light of the evidence presented, the judge said, her tone grave, this court grants the petition for divorce. Furthermore, given the extent of Mrs. Reeves' infidelity and financial misconduct, the court awards full custody of the minor child, Emily Reeves, to Dr. Jack Reeves. Sarah let out a choked sob from across the courtroom, but Jack didn't look at her. His thoughts were only of Emily, of the future they would build together. As he left the courthouse, Jack was surprised to find a small crowd of reporters waiting. Word of the scandal had spread, it seemed. "Dr. Reeves," one called out, "how do you feel about the verdict?" Jack paused, considering his words carefully. "I'm grateful that justice has been served," he said finally. "But more than that, I'm looking forward to moving on with my life and focusing on what really matters, my daughter." Another reporter pushed forward. "There are rumors that the hospital wants you to join their ethics committee. Any comment?" Jack blinked, taken aback. This was the first he'd heard of it. But as he thought about it, a slow smile spread across his face. "If that's true," he said, "I'd be honored. After everything that's happened, I think ensuring ethical behavior in our institutions is more important than ever." As the reporters clamored for more, Jack politely excused himself. He had somewhere more important to be. An hour later, Jack stood in the driveway of a modest suburban home, Emily's small hand clasped in his. A sold sign swung gently in the breeze. "Well, what do you think?" Jack asked, looking down at his daughter. "Is this going to be a good new home for us?" Emily looked up at him, a tentative smile on her face. "It's nice," she said, "but it's going to be different, isn't it? Without Mom?" Jack knelt down, bringing himself to Emily's eye level. "It is going to be different," he admitted. "But different doesn't have to mean bad. We're going to make this our home, you and me. And I promise you, Emily, I'm going to be here for you. Always." Emily's smile grew a little stronger. "I know, Dad," she said. Then, unexpectedly, she threw her arms around Jack's neck in a fierce hug. "You're the only dad I need," she whispered. Jack hugged her back just as tightly, feeling the sting of tears in his eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope, of healing. As they broke apart, Jack stood and ruffled Emily's hair. "Come on," he said, fishing the new house keys out of his pocket. "Let's go check out your new room." Hand in hand, father and daughter walked up the path to their new home. Behind them, the sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. It was, Jack thought, a fitting end to this chapter of their lives. And as he opened the door to their new home, Jack Reeves felt ready, at last, to begin writing the next one.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.
That day, I had been working from home, spending most of my time in the study. Since morning, the cheerful chatter of my husband, Thomas, and his daughter, Hannah, echoed through the house. It was the first time I'd heard them talk with such excitement. Curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly crept toward the hallway to listen. Then I heard something that stopped me cold. "It's so much more peaceful without that annoying wife around," Thomas said, his voice lighthearted. Annoying wife? Was he talking about me? My heart sank, and my mind scrambled to make sense of it, replaying his words over and over. Did he really see me like that? Before I could recover from the shock, Hannah chimed in. "We still need her for my college fees, though. We can't do without that human ATM." Human ATM? Those words stung deeper than I could have imagined. Was that all I was to them? A source of money? I had given so much to support Hannah, believing it was my role as a stepmother, hoping my care would eventually earn her trust and affection. But now, it was clear they didn't value me. They only valued what I provided. Fighting back tears, I quietly returned to my room. My hands trembled as I began packing a suitcase, taking only the essentials. When they left the house for dinner, I slipped out the door without a word. As I drove away, I felt a mix of heartbreak and resolve. Just because I was lonely didn't mean I deserved this. If all they wanted was my money, I had no reason to stay. My name is Catherine, and I'm a mid-level accountant. For 15 years, I've worked diligently in my field, building a steady, stable career. After my first marriage ended, I threw myself into my work, using it as both a distraction and a lifeline. Even during the toughest times, I stayed focused, knowing my career was my anchor. My first husband, Zach, had struggled with alcohol dependency. At first, it seemed like he just drank a little too much on occasion, but over time, it became a daily crutch. He carried unresolved pain from his past, pain I couldn't heal for him, no matter how hard I tried. Counseling or a structured recovery program could have helped, but Zach wasn't ready to face his demons. When our marriage ended, I wasn't lost. I leaned on the skills I had honed through years of hard work. Eventually, I transitioned to a better-paying position and found financial stability. Still, I sometimes wondered if I was meant to live without a family of my own, focusing solely on my career. Then, I met Thomas. Thomas worked as a pharmaceutical salesperson, often visiting my office as part of his job. He wasn't particularly assertive, but there was a gentleness about him that drew me in. My nurturing instinct kicked in, and I wanted to support him. He shared his struggles as a single father raising Hannah after his ex-wife's infidelity. His vulnerability touched me, and I believed we could build a life together. But as time went on, cracks began to show. Thomas often spoke about wanting to find a better-paying job, but seemed stuck in a cycle of switching roles without real reflection. When I asked about his strengths, his answers were vague and uninspiring. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I just feel like I keep failing." I tried to encourage him, explaining that failure was a stepping stone to growth. But his reluctance to take risks or learn from his mistakes worried me. He seemed more content dreaming about success than working for it. Still, I reassured him that my income could provide stability for us while he figured things out. Instead of feeling supported, he seemed to interpret my words as a safety net. "Thanks, Catherine," he said. "Honestly, being an employee doesn't suit me, so this is a relief. I'm not planning to quit now, but it's nice to know I don't have to worry about increasing my income." His response left me uneasy, as if he was shifting the entire financial burden onto me. But I pushed those feelings aside, telling myself he would eventually find his footing. When Thomas and I got married, I met his daughter, Hannah, for the first time. She looked me up and down with a critical gaze before bluntly asking, "So, what exactly do you bring to the table? Good job, decent salaries?" Her words took me aback for a moment. I was stunned into silence, realizing she was essentially questioning my worth. I felt a wave of embarrassment. I didn't consider myself particularly glamorous or charming, but her bluntness caught me off guard. "Hannah, that's rude," Thomas interjected. "I didn't mean anything by it," she replied casually, shrugging. I held back a retort, not wanting to create conflict during our first meeting. Instead, I tried to keep the conversation light. "So, what kind of work do you do, Catherine?" she asked with unexpected curiosity. Surprised, I decided to share a little about my job. Maybe I thought my experience might inspire her or spark ideas for her own future. "Well, I work in accounting. Do you know what accountants do?" "Yeah, like handling expense reports or reimbursements," she said nonchalantly. "That's part of it," I replied. "But there's a lot more involved." I explained my role in simple terms, handling monthly closings, preparing consolidated reports, and crafting financial strategies. I talked about managing transactions, creating budgets, and overseeing financial planning. I tried to convey that my job required both analytical and management skills. "What kind of qualifications do you need for that job?" she asked. "Well, you need accounting certifications, and if you want to advance, experience in finance or banking can be really helpful in this field." "Experience often matters as much as education," I added, hoping to convey the expertise my work required. But Hannah looked completely uninterested. Thomas chimed in, his tone casual. "That sounds pretty busy. So, how much do you make doing all that?" For a moment, I almost answered truthfully. My salary was just shy of 6 figures, a milestone I was working toward. But when I noticed Hannah smirking and glancing at Thomas, as if they were sharing some inside joke, I decided to give a vague response. "Let's just say it's a bit above average for an accountant," I said with a polite smile. Hannah rolled her eyes and made a dismissive noise. She glanced at Thomas, and the two of them exchanged a look that made me feel like an outsider. Trying to lighten the atmosphere, I continued explaining more about my work, but my words seemed to fall flat. I reminded myself that this was just the beginning.
Building a family takes time.
I thought I was determined to support both Thomas and Hannah and be part of their lives. If it came down to it, I was even willing to support Hannah's education financially. However, what I didn't realize at the time was Thomas's true intentions. Over time, it became clear that he had been planning to rely on my income from the very start. He even mentioned wanting to enroll Hannah in an expensive private university, one that was known to accept students as long as the tuition was paid up front. Once we started living together, I began noticing troubling patterns. For instance, Hannah often skipped her tutoring sessions without telling me. One day, the tutoring center even called to inform me that she hadn't shown up. "Hey, Hannah," I knocked on her door. "What happened with tutoring today?" She answered with a bored tone. "I attended remotely." Her excuse didn't sit right with me. The center had recently switched back to in-person sessions and wouldn't have called if she'd attended virtually. I started to worry about her commitment to her education. Did she really have the motivation for college, or was this just another way to take advantage of my support? "Hannah, if you're struggling with any subjects, I can help you review if you'd like," I offered. "Why would I need help?" Hannah shot back, her tone sharp. "I just thought maybe I could help," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You might feel more comfortable asking me questions." She let out a heavy sigh, clearly irritated. "Look, I don't need any of that. It's kind of weird that you're trying to act all motherly." Her words stung more than I expected. My offer wasn't meant to insult her, but it was clear she had taken it the wrong way. I instantly regretted saying anything. Perhaps she was already feeling frustrated about her studies, and my well-meaning comment had only added to her stress. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "You're right. You should go at your own pace." I didn't mean to overstep, but deep down, I knew the issue was serious. Missing tutoring sessions, especially in a fast-paced college prep program, would only make things harder for her in the long run. Without a strong commitment, Hannah could easily fall behind. Later that evening, I decided to bring it up with Thomas. "Thomas, can we talk about Hannah's studies for a minute?" "Sure, what's going on?" he asked. "Please don't scold her," I began, trying to tread carefully, but her tutoring center has called a few times. It seems she hasn't been attending regularly. "Oh, yeah, that doesn't surprise me," he said with a sigh, brushing it off as if it were no big deal. "She's always hated studying." He smiled as he added, "She's got her eye on a private university, one of those schools that will take her as long as we can pay the tuition." His nonchalant attitude unsettled me. Perhaps Hannah lacked motivation because she believed everything would be taken care of for her. But as her stepmother, I didn't feel it was my place to point this out. Instead, I nodded and let the conversation drop. I returned to my room, preparing for an online meeting. My new schedule allowed me to work from home twice a week, giving me more opportunities to observe Thomas and Hannah's behaviors. Little by little, my earlier worries about their intentions began to resurface. I couldn't shake the feeling that they might be expecting me to foot the bill for Hannah's entire college tuition. While I had no problem supporting her dreams, I didn't want to be taken advantage of. As the days passed, I began noticing more troubling patterns. Thomas, for example, would often sleep in on weekdays or return home early in the afternoon. One morning, I walked into the living room and was surprised to see him there. "Oh, hey," I said. "You're here?" "Yes, it's my work-from-home day. Are you off today?" "Actually, I took the morning off," he replied casually. I was really tired from a late night of work yesterday, but as I stood there, I caught a faint whiff of alcohol in the air. It seemed more likely he had been out drinking than working late. I let it slide, but over time, I realized these mornings were becoming a pattern. Thomas often talked about how he never seemed to fit in at work. I had always assumed he was just unlucky, but now I started to wonder if his own habits were to blame. One morning, I accidentally overslept by about 30 minutes because I hadn't been feeling well. My first meeting wasn't until 10 a.m., so I planned to take it slow and ease into the day. As I lay in bed, half asleep, I heard voices coming from downstairs. I glanced at the clock. It was already 9 a.m. Why were there voices at this hour? Thomas should have left for work, and Hannah should have been at school. Curious, I tiptoed down the stairs. "Dad, are you taking the day off again?" I heard Hannah ask. "Of course," Thomas replied, his voice relaxed. "I'm already using up my vacation days. Might as well use them before I quit." "Wait, are you really quitting?" Hannah's voice was filled with surprise. "I'll be technically between jobs," Thomas replied casually. "Not a slacker. Just, taking some time to think." I froze in place. Was he seriously planning to quit his job without telling me? "Well, I'm just a student," Hannah said, her tone casual. "So, I don't have to worry about jobs yet." They kept talking as if responsibility was an abstract concept, something they didn't have to face. And then I heard the words that shattered any illusions I had left. "Life's so much more peaceful without the annoying wife around," Thomas said, chuckling. Annoying wife. Was he really talking about me? My stomach twisted as the realization hit. My breath caught in my throat. To him, I wasn't a partner. I was an inconvenience. And then Hannah's voice chimed in, adding insult to injury. "But we can't have her gone completely. I mean, I still need her around for college expenses, right?" I froze. Did they truly think of me as nothing more than an ATM? A high school student saying that about me was beyond disrespectful. My head spun as I pieced together the truth. From the beginning, I'd been nothing more than financial support to them. Quietly, I stepped back upstairs, my heart racing. I didn't make a sound as I packed my largest suitcase with essentials. When I heard them leave for lunch, I seized the opportunity to escape. Enough was enough. Staying would only drain me emotionally and financially. I had given them countless chances, believing they would change, but they had taken my kindness for weakness. As I walked out of the house, I felt both a weight lifting and a pang of sadness. On my desk, I left the divorce papers. They would know I was serious. I rented a small but cozy apartment near my workplace. It wasn't luxurious, but it gave me the peace and privacy I desperately needed. Almost immediately, the calls began. Thomas left multiple messages, all of which I ignored. I knew he wasn't calling out of affection. He was desperate. A month passed without real contact, though his attempts only grew more frequent. Then, late one night, my phone started buzzing persistently. This time it was Hannah. I could imagine the panic setting in now that their ATM was gone, but deep down, I felt no sympathy. Finally, around midnight, Thomas called again. Sighing, I picked up. I was ready to put an end to this once and for all. "It's late, Thomas. This is highly inappropriate," I said flatly. "Catherine, finally. Where are you?" His voice sounded panicked, but I knew better than to fall for it. "That's not important. Just file the divorce papers," I said firmly. "Divorce? Why?" he asked. His faint confusion only fueled my frustration. "You know exactly why, Thomas. You said enough. I'm done being disrespected. Look, we need to talk. Amelia is planning on attending open house events, and she really wants you there." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Oh, you mean for that expensive private college? The one where tuition costs a fortune?" He hesitated. "Well, yes, but it's important for her future. She needs to be prepared." "Ethan," I interrupted, my voice firm. "It's time you face reality. Supporting Amelia is your responsibility, not mine." His silence spoke volumes. This time, I wouldn't give in to emotional blackmail. "Maybe it's time you found a stable job and stepped up," I said bluntly. "Can't we just talk this out?" he pleaded. "I'm willing to try again." "Really?"
No, Ethan.
"The way you and Amelia treated me, there's no going back from that." He fell silent again, seemingly out of arguments. "I guess I never thought it would come to this," he finally muttered. "That's because you took me for granted." "Both of you did," I said, before hanging up. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had said everything I needed to say. Over time, I stopped checking for their messages. There was no need to revisit the past. I focused on myself, enjoying the freedom and peace that came with moving on. Amelia eventually dropped out of her university plans and took a part-time job. From what I heard, she was struggling with the reality of independence, but at least she was learning. Ethan, on the other hand, drifted between jobs, occasionally reaching out for one last favor. I never responded. I had given them enough chances. It was time to live for myself. I even adopted a rescue cat, finding joy in the small, comforting moments of companionship. Slowly but surely, I rebuilt my life, one step at a time. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free.
Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
Gary woke up from a dream, though as usual, the details were lost to him. He just knew he had dreamt something, but the specifics were out of reach, like sand slipping through his fingers. It was always like that. He never could recall his dreams. He lay there for a few moments, then rolled out of bed, heading for the bathroom. After using the toilet, he felt good, really good, in fact. Another day where he didn't need his medication. That thought made him chuckle. Opening the medicine cabinet, he looked at the familiar bottles. The pills lined up neatly, waiting for him. But he wasn't like the others he saw at the doctor's office. The people with the vacant stares and the sad, hollow eyes. He didn't hear voices, and he wasn't depressed. No, not like them. His next appointment was a few days away, so he knew he'd have to start taking the pills again soon. But not today. Today, he was in control. After showering and shaving, he stood in front of the mirror, studying his reflection. He asked himself, what face do I want to wear today? He practiced a few expressions, trying on different versions of himself, like a man choosing the right suit for an occasion. Finally, he settled on a face he liked, the perfect blend of confidence and calm. He got dressed and made his way to the kitchen, where he fixed himself a simple bowl of cereal. As he ate, his mind drifted to where he would go today. The face he chose always helped guide his plans. Today felt like a field trip kind of day, and the suburbs seemed like the perfect destination. They were peaceful this time of year, a nice place for some quiet contemplation. He placed the empty bowl in the sink, leaving the washing up for later. Right now, he had more important things to plan. He walked into the living room and grabbed his tool bag from beside the couch. Sitting down, he pulled out his map, unfolding it carefully. Small red dots were scattered across various locations, each one holding a memory for him. His eyes traced over the marks before landing on one spot, Sundale, a place he hadn't visited yet. A smile crept across his face as he folded the map and slid it back into the bag. Standing up, he walked over to the full-length mirror by the door. He stripped down to his shorts and admired his reflection. He flexed, appreciating the toned muscles, the strength that hid beneath his otherwise unassuming appearance. He was tougher than he looked, and he liked it that way. His mind flashed back to 2 days ago, at the martial arts studio. He'd been feeling just as good then, practicing kicks and body punches on the heavy bag. But then Ronald had come over, pushing him aside to take over the bag. "Excuse me, I was using that," Gary had said, keeping his voice polite. Ronald, a black belt, had sneered at him. "No belt? If you want a beating, just keep talking." Gary had grabbed Ronald's arm mid-punch, holding it in a firm grip. Ronald had glared at him, shaking his arm free. "Have you lost your mind, fool?" Gary didn't answer then. He didn't need to. He just smiled. Gary said again very politely, "I was using that bag. I would like to finish my workout." The instructor saw something was going on, so he walked over. He stood there a moment with his hands on his hips and asked, "What is going on, you two?" Without taking his eyes off Ronald, Gary said, "I was using the bag. He came over and pushed me out of the way. All I want to do is finish my workout and then go home. He can use it as much as he wants then." The instructor looked at Ronald and said, "That seems reasonable to me. Do you have a problem with that?" Ronald looked at the instructor and said, "He's a no belt. I am a black belt. He should give way to his superiors," as he pointed to Gary. The instructor raised his eyebrows in surprise. He looked at Ronald and said, "I have tried and tried to teach you the reason for martial arts. It is not to bully people. It is for self-defense only and to help those who are not as strong as you. But I haven't been able to teach you that. Maybe it is time you learn your mouth can get you into big trouble." Ronald looked at the instructor with a bit of surprise on his face. He didn't know what he was getting at. He thought the instructor was going to challenge him to a fight or something like that. While he was a black belt, he wasn't sure he could take the instructor and didn't want to find out. The instructor looked at Gary and said, "You up for this?" Gary just smiled and nodded his head once. Ronald looked from the instructor to Gary and back, then smiled in understanding. The instructor called all of the students and put them in a circle. He looked each one in the eye and said, "I don't teach martial arts so you can bully people. When you get the higher belts, I expect a certain level of mental and physical restraint. What we have here is a man who earned his black belt a while ago. While he has the necessary physical skills, he still hasn't learned the mental restraint that goes with those skills. I have tried to teach you to use your skills to help people not hurt. However, Ronald thinks that because he has a black belt, everyone should bow to him, or at the very least, they should get out of his way. Tonight, a man refused to get out of his way, so there is going to be a demonstration tonight. Ronald thinks because Gary doesn't have a belt, he isn't worth respect. Gary believes even if he doesn't have a belt, he deserves respect. There is only one way to settle this. Gary and Ronald had taken opposite sides of the ring and stood waiting for the speech to end. Gary had calmed himself and had done all of the mental exercises he was taught. He was ready, and he was feeling good. Inside and out, he was calm. He knew the adrenaline would only help once the fight started. He looked at Ronald, who was bouncing on the balls of his feet. Gary smiled at him. He knew he was in complete control. The instructor stepped back to ring formed by the students. He looked at Gary and Ronald, then said, "Okay, go for it." Ronald immediately attacked. He threw punches and kicks. Gary blocked some of them, ducked some of them, but some of them found their mark. Gary thought to himself, "Tomorrow I'm going to hurt, but tonight the adrenaline keeps me from feeling it." The students were cheering and booing. They were also shouting advice to both fighters. Gary kept sliding his feet, keeping at least one foot in contact with the mat at all times. He kept just out of Ronald's reach. Ronald kept attacking and trying to move into strike range. After a few minutes, Ronald was breathing hard. He started missing more and more. He noticed his arms were getting heavy. He realized he was getting tired, and he had better end this soon. He renewed his attack and started throwing more punches and kicks. Gary watched all of this. This was going just the way he had planned. He knew Ronald couldn't keep up this level of attack much longer, then it would be his turn. He kept moving back, just at the edge of Ronald's reach. He kept blocking and dodging the strikes. Ronald was having a hard time breathing, and his arms were getting so heavy. He decided to grab Gary and give himself some breathing space. He grabbed Gary in a bear hug, pinning both arms to his side. Gary reared his head back and head-butted Ronald right in the nose. Ronald's nose immediately spurted blood. Ronald howled in pain and dropped Gary. The students grew quiet, looked at the instructor, expecting him to stop the fight. The instructor looked at them and said, "If you are getting mugged and get a bloody nose, what are you going to do? Are you going to say, 'Well, I have a bloody nose, we need to stop'? No, you keep on fighting. This is the same thing. You have to learn to fight through the pain." Once Ronald let go, Gary went on the attack. He started throwing punches and kicks. Unlike Ronald's attack, Gary's hit the mark more often than not. A few minutes later, Ronald's eye was starting to swell shut, and he had a fat lip. Just as the instructor was getting ready to stop the fight, Gary hit Ronald hard and knocked him down. The instructor went over to Ronald and looked at him. "You okay?" he said as he got on one knee. Ronald looked up at him and growled, "I'm fine. I want to finish this," and started to get to his feet. The instructor gently pushed him back on the mat and told him to lay there for now. Then he looked at the circle of students. Just because someone doesn't wear a certain color belt doesn't mean they aren't deserving of your respect. Gary here doesn't wear a colored belt, but I dare say he could beat several of you at the same time. Let this serve as a lesson. You need to have the mental maturity as well as the psychical skill to move up into the higher belts. Then he looked at Ronald and said, "I hope you learned a lesson tonight. If you have, then come back. If you haven't, find a new studio. I don't teach bullies." Gary stood in front of the mirror and saw the night as if it was happening again right in front of him. Just then a horn blared outside and shook him out of his revelry. Gary's eyes refocused on his image. He smiled and looked at the few bruises he had from the fight. "I may have a bruise or two, but Ronald will not be able to see out of that eye for at least 2 more days. He has a fat lip and lots more pain." As Gary talked to himself, he gave a little laugh. He shook his head, then redressed, grabbed his tool bag, went out the door and down the street and caught the bus. As he rode towards Sundale, he watched the sun come up and thought again what a beautiful day this was going to be. When he got to Sundale, he walked along and marveled at the clean sidewalks. The suburbs always had clean sidewalks. Where he lived, the sidewalks were almost black, they were so dirty. They had years of accumulated vomit, urine, spit, blood, and gum on them. These sidewalks were so bright he thought they might blind him. He liked the burbs. The nice neat houses with their neat lawns and gardens. Everything seemed perfect, except he knew what happened when the husbands were away. The 304s who lived in those neat houses cheated on their husbands every day. He walked on muttering to himself. When he got to the corner, he realized he was getting upset. He was shaking, and when he talked, spit flew out of his mouth. He felt good, and when he felt good, he was in control, but he was losing control. He stopped and got himself back under control. Once he had himself back under control, he walked on. He saw the school as soon as he came around the corner. He liked elementary schools. He liked watching the kids going into the school. They were just at the age where they were getting their first taste of independence. When they first got to kindergarten, the moms would drop them off and they would run into the school. The older kids weren't to the age where they knew everything yet. They could still be taught, and he loved teaching them. He was proud that he was the one who taught some of them about how the world works. He had watched kids before. He knew he had to keep moving. When he did that, no one paid any attention. If he looked like just another working stiff, he could hang out and watch the parents drop off the innocents without raising any suspicions. He moved on when school started. He walked around the neighborhood for some time. Finally, he came up to a park where there were several mothers with their children. He watched for a short while, then he caught sight of her. A perfect little girl. She had brown hair that came to just below her ears. He liked brown hair. She had on a cute pants and matching shirt set, and she had the cutest athletic shoes. They were brown-soled with pink tops. He watched her and her mother play for a long time. Finally, the mother called to her and they left the park. As they walked down the street to their home, the little girl would hold her mother's hand for a while. Then she would see something like a flower or a bug that caught her interest, and she would run off to investigate. Gary liked the little high laugh she had. He liked being around kids when they laughed. It made the world right. Gary walked at a distance, so the little girl and her mother had no idea he was following them. The little girl skipped and did little spins. Gary could tell she was young enough to not have any worries or cares. As Gary walked behind them, he swung his tool bag and whistled to himself. When the mother and little girl turned up a driveway, Gary kept walking past. He looked at the house. He said to himself, "Yep, just the kind of house I suspected." It was blue with white trim. There were low bushes lining the front of the house. There wasn't a sidewalk, just a driveway. He noticed the roses on the side of the house. He saw there was a fence around what appeared to be a backyard. He walked 2 houses down and turned up the driveway. They didn't have a garage, and there weren't any cars in the driveway. So, he walked up to the gate and let himself in the backyard. He hopped the fence heading for the little girl's house. He didn't want to hurry too much. He guessed the girl would take a nap before lunch, but before that she would have a snack. So he had time to kill before he paid his visit. As he jumped the second fence, he was greeted by a large dog. He had moved so quickly and quietly he had surprised the sleeping dog. As the dog saw Gary drop down to the lawn, he started barking and then charged Gary. Gary stood there and watched the dog charge him. He was in control, so he was calm. Just as the dog jumped for Gary's chest, he stepped out of the way. As the dog flew past, Gary grabbed his tail. He used the dog's momentum and swung the animal into the fence. The dog made a little yelp and went limp. Gary looked at the unconscious dog and jumped the fence into the little girl's yard. He stole across the yard and peeked into the window. He was looking into a kitchen area. The 304 was the only one he could see. So much the better. It will make the lesson that much easier, he thought to himself. He moved out of sight of the window and opened his tool bag. He pulled out the paper painter's overalls and the latex gloves. When he went on field trips, he always made sure he had the right tools. He slipped into the overalls and gloves. He watched CSI so he knew what the police would be looking for. He was sure not to step into the dirt, that way they wouldn't have footprints to make plaster casts of. He smiled to himself. He was in control. He grabbed his tool bag and moved up to the window again. He looked in and almost cried out. The 304 was kissing some guy in the kitchen. Here she was, getting ready to do some guy in the kitchen while her husband worked hard to make money. Gary sat there for a minute longer, feeling his rage growing. I'm really going to like giving this lesson, he thought to himself. He reached into his tool bag and got his lockpick. When he opened the door, he was sure the 304 and the man hadn't heard him. As he moved into the kitchen, he grabbed his sap from his tool bag. What he saw almost made him gag. The 304 was up against the counter with the guy leaning in and kissing her. At least they both had all of their clothes on. He wasn't sure he wouldn't have thrown up if they were naked. The 304 opened her eyes just in time to see him bring the sap down hard on the side of the guy's head. She screamed as the man gave a little grunt and slid to the floor. Gary dropped his bag and grabbed her by the throat with his left hand. He pushed her up against the cabinet and squeezed. She struggled and grabbed his hand, trying to pry his hand loose, but he was just too strong. He liked watching the faces of the 304s as they realized they were paying for their lifestyles. The 304's eyes bugged out. Her face turned a reddish purple, and she tried to gasp for breath. Gary kept up the pressure until she stopped struggling. He pulled his hat away, and she slid to the floor. Gary knew she wasn't dead yet, just out due to lack of oxygen. He put his sap back in his tool bag and pulled out his knife. He lovingly looked at the thin chrome blade. It was made for just this type of work. But before his knife could do its work, he needed some items. He looked around and found the drawer the 304 kept her dish towels in and pulled several out. Now, he was ready. He felt for the man's pulse on the side of his neck. Gary coved the man's neck with 2 of the towels. Then Gary slid the blade into the artery pulsing under his fingers, blood immediately squirting out. Gary smiled. This was a trick he learned a long time ago. When an artery is cut, blood gets everywhere unless you cover it up. The first time he did this, he was covered in blood. He had to take a shower before he could leave the house. Then he moved to the 304. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, so she was still alive, he observed. He repeated the process with the towel and knife. As he stuck the knife in her neck, her eyes flew open. Gary immediately sat on top of her to keep her from moving. He wasn't worried. It would only take a few minutes before she was out for good. After all movement stopped, Gary got up and washed the knife in the sink. Cleanliness is next to godliness, he said out loud to himself. Then he pulled off the coveralls and gloves. He put them in a plastic garbage bag he had pulled from his tool bag. He put a clean pair of gloves on. He had done this so many times it was second nature to him. He was sure he wouldn't leave anything behind that would lead to him. He looked at the pair on the floor. The blood had pooled around them in a large puddle, so he couldn't walk over to them and close their eyes. As he looked, he noticed the 304's face showed surprise and fear. He hoped the look would freeze on her face forever. He wanted people to know what happens to women who bang other men while their husbands are away. He walked through the living room toward the front door. As he walked through the room, he looked around at the furniture and pictures. A picture on the bookshelf caught his attention. He walked over to look at it. When he got close enough, he let out a little laugh and had a sheepish grin on his face. He noticed a man, woman, and little girl in the picture. The man and woman were standing on either side of the little girl. Gary saw the man and woman were the ones in the kitchen. Oops, I guess she was just having a little daytime fun with her husband, he said with a little laugh. Then getting serious, he said, but she was probably screwing every guy she could. That's what 304's do. He picked up the phone and dialed 911 and left it off the hook. He knew the police would send someone by to check out the call. He left the front door open a little bit. That way the police would get suspicious and look around. He wants them to find the people in the kitchen before the little girl did. As he walked toward the bus stop, he whistled a peppy little tune. He felt good about this field trip. The little girl would learn not to be a 304 like her mommy, and the 304 wouldn't be able to cheat on her husband anymore. When he got home, he grabbed his martial arts uniform and headed to the studio. He needed a good workout, and he had some classes to teach tonight. When he got to the studio, he started working out. After a field trip, he was at his best. Also, he had lots of extra energy to burn off. He looked around for Ronald. If he came in, Gary would give him lots of room. Gary wasn't interested in a fight. He was feeling good and didn't want anything to spoil the mood. When the studio closed, he went home. Now I have other appetites to satisfy, he said to himself as he took his shower. After his field trips, he liked to find his girlfriend, Candy, and spend the evening with her. She was the only one who could satisfy the feelings he had right now. As he was drying off after his shower, he looked at his medication again. He looked in the mirror and said, I feel good. I went on a field trip today. I have put the other face away and don't need to get another one. I'm going to see Candy, so I don't need those tonight. Maybe tomorrow. He went to his closet and found the best jeans and shirt he had and went out. He went to the spot Candy usually hung out, and it didn't take long before he spotted her getting out of a car. He went to her, and since he was her favorite, they went right to her room. As Gary lay there in the afterglow of one of the greatest days he had ever had, he thought, okay, this is the day. I'm going to ask her to marry me. As Candy lay on her side facing away from him, he asked her, don't you have to get back to work? When I'm with you, I can take the night off. Now go to sleep. I'm tired. I just want to help you with the rent and stuff like you said. I want to ask you something. Do you love me? Candy sighed and barely awake answered, of course I love you. Gary gathered up his courage and asked, then will you marry me? When Candy answered, her voice was just a whisper, but you could still hear the irritation in it. Yeah, whatever. Now would you just go to sleep? Gary's heart swelled. The woman he loved with all of his heart, and who loved him with all of her heart, was going to marry him. He lay in the semi-dark thinking of all the things that needed to be done. First, he had to get a ring. He knew a pawn shop he could get the ring from, so that was one thing done. As he was going over the details for their wedding, he drifted off to sleep. He awoke early as usual and left the room very quietly. He didn't want to wake Candy. She worked nights in customer service and needed her sleep. He went home and got his money. He looked at the medications again and decided he didn't need them. He wasn't hearing voices or seeing things, so he wasn't crazy. Anyway, the stuff made him tired, and he didn't like feeling that way. After the field trip and the night with Candy, He felt he was on top of the world. He went to the pawn shop and talked to the owner. The owner was very helpful, and they settled on a small diamond for a price he could afford. Afterward, he went to the studio and worked out a bit. Ronald showed up, but kept his distance. Gary was thankful for that. He didn't want trouble with Ronald tonight. He thought to himself, I'm going to have to do something about Ronald someday. Maybe a field trip. He only stayed about 2 hours and had someone else teach his class. He went home, took a shower, and went to look for Candy. When he couldn't find her, he found her friend Tiffany. Hey, where can I find Candy? Tiffany looked at him with a mixture of surprise and sadness. Sweetie, don't you know? Don't I know what? Gary said. Mr. Brown called for her today. No one has seen her since. You didn't hear this from me. Mr. Brown likes it rough, and I think he got too rough and killed her. But like I said, you didn't hear that from me. Understand? Gary stood there stunned. He couldn't believe what Tiffany had just said. His brain heard the words, but just couldn't process them. Hey, did you just hear what I said? I said you can't tell anyone what I just said. Tiffany looked at him with a worried expression on her face. Gary got control of himself. He stood there another minute and gathered his thoughts. Then he looked at Tiffany with a face devoid of emotion and said, I heard you. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. Tiffany tried to light a cigarette, but her hands were shaking too much. Thanks. I know you felt something for Candy. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. Gary knew what he had to do. This thought came as clear as when he got them for his field trips. This was the woman he loved. The woman who would have his children. They were going to move out of this area of the city. They would find somewhere nice. With his disability pay and the money she made from her customer service job, they could make it. He started walking home. He knew who Brown was. He was a dirtbag drug dealer. First thing he had to do was go home and put on the correct face. Then he had to find Chimes. Chimes was Lola's manager. He carried a Bell's keychain in his pockets, so he jingled all the time. Gary opened the door to his apartment. Whenever he walked in, he felt safe. This was his sanctuary. Whenever he was inside, he could be himself. He didn't need to put on a face. He never felt more in control than he did now. He looked in the mirror and decided on the face he was going to put on. He had a plan, and this face was just the right one. He grabbed his tool bag and walked out to the street where he thought he would find Chimes. He figured Chimes could lead him or show him where Brown was. He asked a few of Chimes' employees where he could be found. One girl told him she thought he was at the coffee shop down the street. He walked on the opposite side of the street from the coffee shop. The street lights had been knocked out by the drug dealers, so the whole street was in shadows. He melted into a doorway across from the coffee shop and looked in the big front window. He saw Chimes sitting with Brown in a booth near the back. Between the front door and Brown were two rough-looking thugs. Gary knew these must be Brown's bodyguards. He gripped his tool bag tightly and walked across the street. He opened the door and walked in. As soon as he cleared the door, he dropped his tool bag on a table. He continued to walk toward Chimes and Brown. As he got closer, he said in a loud tone, Chimes, can you help me out? I'm a little short and need a job. The two bodyguards got up from the table and started to block his way. One pulled his gun out. Gary was ready for them. He had been practicing martial arts for 20 years. He just shut down the thought section of his brain and reacted. He grabbed the gun with his left hand and twisted it up. With his right elbow, he hit the guy under the chin. The thug stumbled back and fell. Gary brought his foot down hard on the second guy's knee. There was an audible crack as the leg broke. Gary grabbed the guy on the back of the head by the hair. As the guy started to fall, Gary brought his head down hard on the table. The thug fell unconscious and rolled onto the floor. The first guy had recovered and started to swing at Gary. Gary blocked the swing and brought his knee up to the thug's groin. The thug let out a little oof and fell to his knees. Gary kicked him on the side of the head. He fell over unconscious, still grabbing his groin. The whole fight had taken no more than 10 seconds. Brown started to pull his gun, but Chimes stopped him. He's one of Lola's customers, and he does some courier work for me once in a while. So he's cool, just a bit nuts. Gary stood and looked at the two men and said, Chimes, you got anything for me? Brown looked at Gary and said, You just walked through two of my best, and you did it without a gun. Gary gave a sheepish grin, looked at the two on the floor, then back at Brown and said, Hey, I'm sorry. I didn't know they were yours. They just jumped up with a gun and I reacted. That's all right. If they couldn't protect me, what good are they? You said you were looking for a job? How about being my bodyguard? Gary walked over to one of the thugs, picked up his gun, and shoved it in his belt. Then he walked toward his tool bag and said over his shoulder, Let me get my bag first. Yes, I would like to work for you. And don't worry, I'll take care of you. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Joan and Richard had known each other since high school. Their friendship blossomed into a nearly 30-year marriage. Richard, a software developer, and Joan, a hospital lab technician, built a life together based on shared dreams and mutual respect. But over time, subtle changes appeared in their relationship. Joan grew more distant, which worried Richard, but he attributed it to work stress. Lately, Joan had become secretive and preoccupied, but Richard trusted her and didn't push. Unbeknownst to him, Joan was torn between her family and a resurfaced connection from her past. As she prepared for a vacation with her sister, Richard hoped the time apart would help them reconnect. On Sunday, October 3rd, 2010, as Joan and her sister headed for the airport shuttle, Richard wished her well and joked, "Enjoy yourself and don't worry about me. I'll be fine." Joan smiled, and her sister Brenda teased, "Just don't let your sister get into trouble." Joan playfully responded, "I'll behave." "Behave yourself. I'll be back in 2 weeks, and I expect the house to be intact. Be careful, and remember, I love you more than anything," Joan said, kissing Richard deeply before leaving. Brenda, impatient in the van, quipped, "Come on, we've got a plane to catch." Joan mouthed, "Which?" while Richard rolled his eyes and said, "Bye, hun, I love you too." As the van drove away, Richard muttered, "Finally, they're gone." Returning to the house, Richard thought excitedly about his surprise plan. Over the next few days, he and their son Mark would transform the master bedroom into Joan's dream room from a magazine. This was his special 30th anniversary gift. Richard called Mark, urging him to get moving. They had a lot of work to do, painting, replacing the carpet, and assembling new furniture, all while Joan was away on her Caribbean cruise. Richard began packing up the bedroom, moving everything into the spare room. After emptying the dresser, nightstands, and armoire, he faced the challenge of clearing out their 2 large walk-in closets. Over 30 years, these closets had become storage for all kinds of things, thanks to both Richard's and Joan's pack-rat tendencies. They kept everything from old tools to school papers, making the task daunting but essential for the surprise renovation. With a sigh, Richard headed into his closet. Nearly an hour later, he had everything boxed up and moved to the spare bedroom. Next, he tackled Joan's closet, feeling overwhelmed just standing at the entrance. Mark entered, saying, "I brought you lunch," and promptly tripped over some boxes. "Geez," Richard exclaimed, "knock or something. You almost gave me a heart attack." "Sorry, here's your sandwich and soda," Mark replied. They sat on the bed and ate in silence for about 15 minutes. After finishing, Richard said, "I'll pack the small stuff and you move the larger items to the spare room. Then we need to get the furniture to the garage for Goodwill." "Okay," Mark agreed, as usual, with a short response. They began working on Joan's closet. Richard packed clothes, shoes, and small items, while Mark carried boxes to the spare room. When Mark found a small case on a top shelf, he asked, "What's this?" Richard recognized it as part of an old luggage set from his late mother-in-law. He attempted to open it, but found the latches locked. "Just put it with the other stuff," he said. It took 2 hours to clear the closet. After a break, they disassembled the furniture and moved it to the garage. By dinner time, they were exhausted. Richard gave Mark $20 for pizza, and they had beer waiting in the fridge. After dinner, Mark left to avoid upsetting his wife, Brandy. Richard cleaned up and got back to work, prepping the room for painting. By 9 p.m., he was done with taping, plastering, and sanding. Tired, he grabbed a beer and collapsed in his lounge chair, falling asleep almost immediately. The next morning, Mark arrived at 7 a.m., as promised, and they ate a quick breakfast of cereal. "Today's all about painting," Richard said. "I'll handle the high spots, you do the lower ones. We need to finish everything, no matter how late." Mark agreed, noting that Brandy would be at her mother's all day. They spent the day painting, wrapping up with Richard, again asleep with a beer in front of the TV, but this time, he showered first. On Tuesday, October 5th at 6 a.m., the carpet installation crew arrived. With nothing to do but stay out of their way, Richard had breakfast and marveled at how quickly the professionals worked. By 10 a.m., the carpet was installed, and he had some time before the furniture arrived at noon. Richard began sorting through the spare room, finding the beige cosmetics case again. It seemed heavier than it should, and curiosity got the best of him. He tried to open it with a paperclip, but was interrupted by the doorbell. The furniture delivery arrived, and after showing them where everything went, Richard left them to do their job. Once the new furniture was in place, Richard started the long process of moving everything back from the spare room. By midnight, exhausted, he gave up and headed for his lounge chair, beer in hand. On Wednesday, October 6, 2010, Richard slept in. By 9 a.m., he took the old furniture to Goodwill and stopped at Denny's for breakfast. By noon, He was back home, finishing the cleanup. After placing everything back in the bedroom, he hung a banner over the bed that read, "Surprise." Before calling it a day, Richard noticed a foot-long gouge in the paint. "Damn," he muttered, and spent a few minutes touching it up. Afterward, he decided to clean up, shower, and have dinner. While washing his paintbrush in the bathroom, it fell and landed on the small cosmetics case. Frustrated, he grabbed a rag and some turpentine, cleaning the case until it looked as good as new. Curious about the case's contents, Richard retrieved a jar of old keys from the garage and found one that fit the Samsonite luggage locks. Sitting at the kitchen table, Richard unlocked the case. Inside, he found a large, unopened manila envelope addressed to Joan from an A. Stevens in Seattle, dated September 15, 1991. He set it aside and pulled out a blue bikini, smiling at the thought of Joan wearing it. But what he discovered next made his heart skip a beat. Beneath the bikini was a photo of Joan kissing another man at a dinner table. Shocked, Richard's hands trembled as he examined the photo. His mind couldn't process why his wife was kissing someone else. Feeling nauseous, he rushed to the bathroom. After calming down, he returned to the kitchen and stared at the contents on the table. The cosmetics case, the manila envelope, the bikini, and the photo. His world crumbling before him. Richard sat down and pulled out a stack of photos from the case. Each one featured the same man. Some formal, some explicit, including a few old Polaroids. He found a woman's white silk scarf wrapped around letters tied with a red ribbon. The letters, addressed to Joan at work, were postmarked between 1989 and 1991. Richard took the earliest letter and began to read. June 22nd, 1989. My dearest Joan, it's been only a month, but I miss you terribly. I miss your voice, your touch, your lips, and most of all, your presence beside me in bed. I'll only call and write you at work, as you asked, to avoid any trouble. San Diego is everything I hoped for, but it's incomplete without you. I can't wait to be with you again. With all my love, Tim. Stunned, Richard shouted, "Holy crap, she had a lover!" He threw the letter down, overwhelmed by questions. He realized the only way to understand was to go through everything in the case. He moved the contents to the living room and sat down, muttering about Joan's pack rat habits. He started unpacking the case. Inside was a blue felt jewelry box containing a gold heart-shaped locket he recognized from a photo of Joan at a fancy dinner. He found napkins with "I love you" written on one and a phone number on the other, an invitation to a 1990 awards ceremony for Dr. Timothy Dahl and guest, and a dried red rose. Other items included matchbooks, hotel receipts, a California map, and personal mementos like a black velvet sleep mask and a tube of KY jelly. Confused and hurt, Richard opened the large manila envelope. Inside were more letters and photos, including Polaroids of Joan, some explicit, others of her with Tim. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to continue. Richard found letters Joan had written to Tim, expressing her deep love and pain at his move to California. She begged him to return, saying she couldn't let him go. Overwhelmed, Richard cried out, unsure what to do. Torn between his love for Joan and the revelation of her affair, he collapsed in tears, curling up on the floor until he fell asleep. On Thursday, October 7th, 2010, Joan was frustrated with her phone's lack of signal. "Why can't I get a connection?" she muttered. Brenda, ever sarcastic, replied, "We're on a ship, dummy. Why do you want to call home anyway? Rich is probably doing something boring. Enjoy yourself." Annoyed, Joan shot back, "You're a pain sometimes. I'm going to see if I can get a message to Rich," and walked off, calling Brenda a witch under her breath. At the ship's communications office, Joan tried calling home, but no one answered. She sent an email to Rich, detailing the fun she was having in Brenda's antics, then returned to the pool, disappointed she couldn't reach him. Meanwhile, Richard woke up on the living room floor, surrounded by the contents of Joan's cosmetics case. The pain from discovering her affair lingered, but he knew he had to face the day. After his morning routine, he stared at the mess on the floor, his eyes resting on an unclothed photo of Joan from her babe period. Richard reflected on their history. They had known each other since high school, where Joan, though average in appearance, saw something special in Richard. They dated through college and married shortly after graduating. Richard worked in computer science, and Joan became a lab technologist. They gradually built their careers, bought a house, and had a son, Mark. After a few years, Joan entered what Richard called her babe period. She lost weight, tanned, and got a new wardrobe, attracting attention wherever they went. Despite the admiration from others, Joan remained loyal to Richard. However, Joan's babe period ended when she became emotionally drained from work, leading to a period of depression. Richard took care of Mark and the household until Joan recovered. One day, she tearfully apologized for forgetting Richard's birthday, overwhelmed by her struggles. Richard reassured her, joking that she could make it up to him over the weekend. Soon after, Joan gained weight again, returning to her pre-babe period size. The attention she once received faded, but she and Richard were happy. Richard didn't care about the weight. He loved her and found her voluptuousness sexy. Now, Richard stood over the contents of Joan's cosmetics case, staring at her unclothed photo. No matter how much this hurts, I need to find out what this all means, and if we still have a future, he said aloud. He picked up the next letter. August 19th, 1989. Darling Joan, our time together last week was incredible. I can still smell your perfume and hear your moans. The plane ride home was agonizing because I was getting further from you. Our love won't fade, even with distance. The third time we made love was the most tender experience of my life. I love you so much. With all my heart, Tim. Richard thought, this is exactly how Joan and I used to be. But now, she's doing this with someone else. Angry and hurt, he grabbed the next letter. August 21st, 1989. My love, it took me days to recover from our time together, but I'd do it all again. I'm sorry we only had one day, but it was unforgettable. I love you deeply. I'm so torn between you and my perfect life at home. I need both of you in my life. I can't imagine living without either of you. I'm confused, but know you'll always be in my heart and bed. Joan. Stunned, Richard muttered. She loves both of us? Is she crazy? Or am I missing something? What if Mark isn't even my son? Determined to uncover the truth, Richard continued reading the letters throughout the day. Occasionally, he took breaks to pace, get fresh air, or cry. As he examined more of the contents, Richard found further evidence of Joan's affair, receipts, matchbooks, and other mementos from their secret meetings. Life as he knew it had completely unraveled. As Richard was about to put everything back into the cosmetics case, he noticed another letter he hadn't seen before. It was from Anna Stevens, Tim's sister, dated August 14th, 1991. Joan, my name is Anna Stevens, Tim's sister. I found your letter to him and was shocked. I never imagined Tim having an affair, but it's clear from your words that you loved each other deeply. Tim died last week in a car accident. We had his funeral yesterday, and I've enclosed a service card for you. I'm helping his wife Ellen sort through his belongings and will try to keep her from finding out about you. If I find more of your things, I'll send them to you. Please don't contact me or Tim's family. I'm sorry for your loss. Anna Stevens. The letter was tear-stained and crumpled. This explains why Joan was so depressed that month, Richard thought. Her lover had just died. No wonder she was in bed for weeks and even missed my birthday. Richard wrestled with how Joan could claim to love both him and her lover. How do you give 100% to two people? She had to lie to me constantly about where she was, those lab conventions, and even her love for me. He realized Joan's affair with the married doctor had lasted over 3 years, likely starting around the time the doctor came to the hospital. They met secretly at hotels, sometimes in Joan's office, and continued their affair even after he moved to San Diego. They saw each other during his visits home or on out-of-town trips. Joan passed off as work conferences. Lost in thought, Richard noticed it was already 10 p.m. He had spent the entire day reading and reflecting. Needing air, he stepped outside into the night, leaving the door unlocked, confused and hurt. The next day, Joan left another voicemail. Rich, where are you? I tried to call yesterday. I miss you and love you. Please be there tonight, or I might just stay on this ship forever. Back at home, Richard listened silently, bitterly muttering, She says she loves me. Liar. He stumbled to the bathroom, haunted by her words. I love you too, you two-timing witch, he replied to the imaginary Joan in his head. But I can't believe anything you say anymore. I've got to figure out what to do. Determined to plan his next steps, Richard looked at himself in the mirror. God, you look awful, he said. You haven't showered or eaten in days. That's the first thing to fix. After a hot shower, shave, and a quick breakfast of cereal, Richard sat at the kitchen table to think about his future. An hour later, he had a rough plan and started making a list of tasks. His top priority was to determine if Mark was his biological son. He ordered a home DNA testing kit for overnight delivery. With a week until Joan returned, he decided to keep busy with chores to avoid sinking into depression. Meanwhile, Joan grew increasingly worried about not hearing from Richard. She left messages for both him and Mark, asking her son to check on his father. "I hope nothing's wrong," she thought, her concern growing. The next day, Mark grumbled as he headed to his dad's house, annoyed at having to check on him. After pounding on the door, Richard finally called out from the backyard where he was trimming a tree. Frustrated, Mark got his father a bottle of water and then retrieved the mail, which included the DNA test kit. Richard, pretending it was a flu test, convinced Mark to participate. Afterward, Mark urged his father to call Joan and left. Richard completed the DNA test and sealed it in the return envelope, ready to mail on Monday. He spent the rest of the day doing household chores to keep his mind off Joan. That night, he finally ate a decent meal, pizza and beer. On Sunday morning, Richard left a voicemail for Joan saying he was fine and would call her on Monday. He spent the day at the park watching ducks and families, trying to distract himself. On Monday, October 11th, Richard followed his usual routine but made significant changes. He mailed the DNA test and then went to his workplace's HR office to apply for immediate retirement, something he hadn't planned to do until Joan could retire too. Those plans were now gone. He informed his boss of his decision and took 2 weeks of leave. Before leaving, Richard called his friend and attorney, Luke Pauley, asking for a meeting at 1 p.m. Luke agreed, and Richard prepared to seek advice on his next steps. An hour later, after a few quick goodbyes, Richard's 30-year career with the county government was over, fitting into just 2 boxes. He then visited the bank, splitting his funds into a new checking account in his name. He also retrieved his passport and important papers from the safety deposit box. The bank helped him get a new credit card and remove his name from Joan's. He paid off the balance. At the insurance agency, he changed the beneficiary of his life insurance from Joan and Mark to just Mark and updated the car insurance to separate their policies. Next, Richard met with his attorney, Luke Pauley. Luke joked about how they should get together more often, then noticed Richard seemed troubled. Richard asked about the statute of limitations on divorce and explained Joan's affair. Luke was shocked, unable to believe it, but Richard insisted on divorce papers. Luke advised him to talk to Joan and consider counseling, but as his lawyer, he agreed to draft the papers, suggesting a 50-50th split. Richard also asked Luke to remove Joan from his will, making Mark the sole beneficiary. Luke recommended again that Richard talk to Joan, but Richard wasn't ready. He wanted time alone to think and would contact Luke once settled. That night, unable to sleep in the newly redecorated bedroom, Richard ended up in the lounge chair, thinking about the days ahead. On Tuesday, October 12, 2010, Richard received another voicemail from Joan but didn't respond. He knew he needed to finalize everything before she returned, planning to be gone before then. By Wednesday, October 13, 2010, Richard had his new credit card and everything set up at the bank. He called Luke to check on the paperwork, but Luke deliberately delayed it, hoping Richard would talk to Joan. Richard gave Luke a landline number for emergencies, but insisted Joan not be given the number. Richard spent the rest of the day preparing to leave. Disappointed that the DNA test results hadn't arrived, he still quietly disappeared that night at 9 p.m., leaving everything behind. Thursday, October 14, 2010. Joan, in a panic, calls Mark. "Mark, go check on your father. I haven't spoken to him since I left. Call me right back after you find him. I need to talk to him before I get home Friday, and someone has to pick us up at the airport." "Yes, Mom, I'll call you after I talk to Dad. Bye," Mark replies, dropping the phone and drifting back to sleep next to Brandy. Friday, October 15, 2010. Joan and Brenda return from their trip. "Wake up, we're home." Joan nudges her sister as the airport shuttle drops her off at the house. Brenda mumbles, "Just let me sleep until they get to my house," turning away from the door. Joan tips the driver, hauls her luggage inside, and calls out, "Rich, I'm home. Where are you?" Silence. She checks the kitchen for a note, but finds nothing. She opens the back door and calls again, still no response. "He must be at the airport waiting for us," she thinks. Joan calls Richard's cell phone, only to hear it ringing on the counter. "He forgot it again," she sighs. She starts unpacking upstairs. When she opens the bedroom door, she's stunned by the transformation. A large surprise banner hangs over the bed. Everything is just as she dreamed. "Rich, you sneaky planner," she thinks. "I can't wait to thank you tonight." She admires the new furniture, carpet, and colors, overwhelmed with happiness. But as she unpacks, her eyes fall on the banner again. A small photo is attached, a picture of her and Tim at the Chicago Awards banquet with the number written over her face. Her heart sinks. "Oh my God, no!" Panicked, Joan searches for the cosmetics case but can't find it. She tears through the house, growing more desperate. Realizing Richard must have found it, she collapses on the bed, crying uncontrollably. She tries calling Mark, her sister, and their friends. No one knows where Richard is. Feeling alone, she sobs, terrified that he's gone for good. After an hour, Joan tries calling everyone again, but still no luck. Brenda eventually arrives and tries to calm her. He can't have gone far. Have you called his friends? Maybe he's at a ball game? But Brenda's words only heighten Joan's anxiety. Joan can't bring herself to tell Brenda the truth about Tim. She's convinced Richard discovered the affair from 20 years ago and left for good. She sends Brenda home, promising to call if Richard shows up. Saturday, October 16th, 2010. Joan spends the day crying and worrying. Brenda suggests calling the police, but when Joan does, the dispatcher tells her she has to wait 24 hours to report someone missing. Joan also contacts local hospitals but finds no trace of Richard. While relieved he isn't hurt, she's even more anxious because she still can't find him. Sunday. Joan doesn't hear from Richard and spends the entire day in bed crying and praying. God, please bring Rich back. I'll do anything. Just let him call so we can talk. I love him, and my heart is breaking. Monday. Joan files a missing persons report with the police. An officer comes by, takes Richard's photo and description, and leaves with the vague promise, "We'll let you know if we find anything." Joan fears this means they'll call only if they find his body. Later, Joan opens an overnight envelope addressed to Richard, hoping for a clue. Inside is a letter from a DNA testing company confirming that Richard and Mark are indeed father and son. Joan, familiar with DNA tests, realizes Richard must have doubted Mark's paternity, thinking Tim could be Mark's father. But Tim came into my life after Mark was born, she thinks. She notices the results were also sent to Luke Pauley, their lawyer, and decides to call him. Joan contacts Luke, who explains that Richard was deeply depressed and mentioned the contents of her cosmetics case. He says Richard felt betrayed and needed time to think. Luke admits that Richard asked him to prepare divorce papers, but hasn't signed them yet. Joan pleads to know where Richard is, but Luke insists he doesn't know. However, he promises to contact her before Richard signs anything. Joan spends the rest of the day crying and praying for Richard to return. 10 days later, frustrated with Luke's delay, Joan discovers through Mark that Richard is staying at Aunt Mary's lake house. She drives there, finding Richard sitting by the water looking unkempt and lost. She sits beside him, but he doesn't acknowledge her, staring into the distance. Joan takes his cold hand and begins speaking. "Rich, I have a story to tell you. I'll be completely honest and answer any questions. Please, honey, just listen." Richard remains still, but Joan continues talking. "I met Tim at Mark's 3rd birthday party at the hospital daycare. He mistook the party for his daughter, who shares the same birthday as Mark. We laughed and talked about our kids and, eventually, about ourselves. He was a new doctor, feeling overwhelmed, so we started having lunch together regularly. We became friends, and he introduced me to research that led me to join Weight Watchers. Over time, our conversations grew more personal. He complimented me on my weight loss, and we began sharing our desires and fantasies. One day, he invited me to dinner after work, and I realized I had feelings for him. At dinner, we admitted our feelings but agreed we didn't want to hurt our spouses. However, after that we started holding hands, and eventually he kissed me. I felt the same way with his kiss as I did with yours, Rich. We had dinner at the Marriott one night and ended up getting a room. That's when we first made love. I loved him just as I loved you, and I couldn't understand how I could love 2 men at once. I didn't want it to stop, and we continued seeing each other. I loved both of you deeply and didn't know how to solve the problem. Suddenly, Richard stands up and walks toward the house without a word. Joan, stunned, tries to follow, but all the doors are locked. As dusk falls and the temperature drops, she retreats to her car, determined to wait for him. The next morning, Joan wakes to the sound of a motorboat. She sees Richard in a small skiff, drifting in the middle of the lake. She watches as he stands up and falls into the water, knowing he can't swim. Panicked, she screams for help, and a neighbor rushes out in his boat. Joan watches anxiously as the neighbor brings Richard back to shore. She can't tell if he's alive. Together, they get Richard inside, out of his wet clothes, and onto a bed. After thanking the neighbor, Joan spends the next hour cleaning Richard up, dressing him in dry clothes, and even shaving him. Then, she sits beside the bed, watching him sleep. 2 hours later, Richard gets up, goes to the kitchen table, and finally acknowledges Joan. He stares at her and begins to cry. After several attempts, he manages to speak. "Do you remember me telling you about my old girlfriend, Carolyn? We dated for about a year. One day she broke up with me over the phone saying she had a new boyfriend. I rushed to her house, and they were waiting for me. I was furious but didn't do anything, even when her new boyfriend taunted me. I walked away, humiliated. Later, I ran into her new boyfriend again. I planned to strike him up with a pool stick I kept in my car, but a guy from the neighborhood, Larry, stopped me. He told me no girl was worth what I was about to do. I believed him until I met you. You are worth everything, even dying for. Today on the lake, I thought of that story again. I realized that eliminating myself over what you did was wrong. I wanted to live, to talk to you. I need to know why. Richard then puts his head down on the table. Joan embraces him, and they quietly cry together. After a long silence, Richard looks at Joan and simply says, "Let's go home." 2 months later, life remains tense between them. They live in the same house, but sleep in separate rooms. Richard is distant, and Joan is always on edge. They haven't really talked, and their son Mark only visits briefly. Every weekend, Richard spends time at Aunt Mary's house, while Joan worries he might damage himself again. Today is Mark's birthday, and the family gathers for cake and presents. When it's Richard's turn, he retrieves the cosmetics case and the DNA test report from the garage, placing them on the table. Joan is horrified, unsure of his intentions. Richard calmly says, "Mark, your mother has a story to tell you. It won't be easy, but you need to listen." Then he leaves the house. Joan, overwhelmed, runs from the room in tears. Mark and his wife Brandy try to comfort her, but all they hear is her crying behind the bedroom door. After about an hour, Joan comes back down and begins telling Mark about her past with Tim. Around midnight, Richard returns home and tells Mark, "Go home, I'll take it from here." After they leave, Richard hands Joan a card that reads, "Dr. Jean Brooks, marriage counselor. We have an appointment next Tuesday at 6. Without another word, he heads upstairs to bed. Next Tuesday, Dr. Brooks prepares for her session with the Alexanders. This case will be challenging, she thinks. It looks like typical infidelity, but there are deeper layers. I hope I can help them. When Richard and Joan arrive, Dr. Brooks warmly welcomes them. "Please have a seat on the couch," she says. "Joan, I specialize in marital issues, particularly infidelity. My goal is to uncover the root causes and help couples find common ground. Sometimes couples decide to part ways, but I'm optimistic we can find a way forward. I don't perform miracles, but we'll find answers. Our sessions will involve open discussions, with honesty as the key rule. I'll guide the conversation and stop it when needed. I won't sugarcoat things, and you might not always like what I say, but we'll uncover the truths in your marriage. Some truths will be enlightening, others painful, but we'll address them together. After our initial session, I'll meet with each of you individually to get your full perspective. After each joint session, spend time at home discussing what we talked about, but avoid new topics. If you can't discuss something calmly, save it for the next session. Any questions?" Both Joan and Richard shake their heads. "Okay, let's begin." The hour flies by, and on the way home, they don't speak. Once home, Joan asks, "How do you want to handle this? Maybe we could talk for an hour after we get home with some wine in the living room. I'll need tissues. How does that sound?" Richard agrees, but suggests a couple of changes. "Let's have soda or water. No booze. I don't want to say something I'll regret." And turn off the phones, so we aren't interrupted. Joan agrees and fetches the phones. They sit in silence for a while, unsure of where to start. Finally, Richard breaks the silence. "Today, you said you've always been happy with me, but how can that be true if you were with another man right after we married? Didn't I give you what you wanted? What did I do wrong?" Joan interrupts. "Dr. Brooks said to stick to what we discussed today. Just about us, not anyone else. We'll address others after we've discussed it in session. But I will say this, I've always been happy with you and our marriage, Rich. That's the truth. I love you and always have. If you were gone, I would be lost. That's my truth, as God is my witness." Richard sighs. "You're right, Joan. I got ahead of myself. You know how impatient I can be. Until recently, I thought we had an ideal marriage. Sure, we had our arguments, but I never doubted us. I never looked for anyone else. You were always my anchor. But now, everything I believed in feels upside down. I don't know what's real anymore. It hurts to even look at you, because I can't stop thinking about those letters and imagining you with—" "Stop," Joan interrupts. "We'll talk about that later, not now." "Fine, but answer this. How many others were there? Should I expect to find more secrets around the house? How many men have you been with during our happy marriage?" "What are you accusing me of?" Joan snaps. "I've only been with 2 men, Tim and you. Now you're accusing me of sleeping around?" From my perspective, you lied about one man. How can I trust you didn't lie about others? Richard counters, his voice rising. I haven't been with anyone else, Joan insists. But let's discuss that in session. No, I need to know now. I can't keep living with this pain. If we can't talk about it, then I'm done. I'm going to bed. Richard storms upstairs, slamming the door. Joan sits in the dark, muttering, that didn't go well. 4 weeks later, the drive home from another session is tense. They both wait to talk until they're home. Once settled, Joan speaks first. Hon, you never told me you read all the letters. I didn't think about it at first, Richard replies flatly. I was angry and embarrassed, hiding all this from you. I didn't consider your pain, what it would do to you to read those letters. I'm so sorry, Rich. I can't change the past, but I'll do anything to help us move forward. I love you, and I want you back. Richard takes a deep breath. Joan, I never stopped loving you, even when this felt like the worst pain of my life. But the worst part is the images of you with another man. They haunt me constantly, making me physically sick. I don't think you can understand that kind of pain. Rich, we need to talk to Dr. Brooks about dealing with those thoughts. But for now, let's just focus on being together. Maybe we can take a few days off, go to the mountains, and just be us without pressure. How does that sound? I'm not sure, Richard replies cautiously. I still feel uneasy around you, but if we want to move forward, we need to be together. So, okay, let's go. Just no sharp objects, he jokes, making them both laugh for the first time in a while. 2 weeks later, during the drive home, Joan hesitates, but finally asks, Rich, what did you mean by my babe period? I don't want to talk about it, Richard replies curtly. Why not? Because it hurts too much. Let's drop it. I don't understand. What did I do that hurt you? Reluctantly, Richard responds, Your babe period was when you joined Weight Watchers, lost weight, tanned, got your nails done, and bought a new Zexy wardrobe. You were no longer the cute, overweight woman I married. You became a babe. Men noticed you, and I was proud but also worried someone better might take you away. It all changed when you got sick and returned to your old self. I loved you then and now, but knowing that transformation wasn't for me but for another man hurts. It ruins the memory. Joan whispers, Oh God, how could you? Richard silently leaves for bed. 8 weeks later, after a tense session with Dr. Brooks, they sit quietly in the living room. Richard finally says, I don't get it. Dr. Brooks said loving two people at once is common, but it sounds like nonsense to me. I understand the logic, but not the emotions. Joan tries to explain. She meant I loved both you and Tim simultaneously, which usually leads to someone getting hurt. We were hurt later. The sequential part is when people move on to love again after a loss, which is common. I get it. Richard sighs. But I don't. I can't imagine loving someone else without diminishing my love for you. You can't give 100% to two people at the same time, Joan admits. I don't fully understand it either, but when I was with you, you were my whole world. When I was with Tim, he was. It was like flipping a switch between you two. I loved both of you completely. Richard nods. We'll need to keep talking about this. For now, let's write down questions for the next session. They both remain unsatisfied and retreat to separate bedrooms. 6 weeks later, Joan is crying much less as they sit in the living room. Richard begins, Honey, I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't mean it. Well, maybe I did in some way, but I wasn't trying to hurt you or be spiteful. I just said I was glad he died because I didn't have to share you with him. It wasn't until Dr. Brooks explained that his end of life was as hard on you as mine would be that I started to see it from your perspective. I get it a little now. The man you loved died, and you had no one to grieve with. You were alone in your grief. You had me, but you couldn't tell me without losing me. I understand why you were depressed. I would have been too if you had died. I'm sorry I said it the way I did. I didn't mean it. Oh, Rich, you can be so damn stubborn sometimes, Joan responds, her voice quivering with emotion. You've been trying to understand how I could feel the same way about two men at once, but you don't see how losing one of them would devastate me? Well, do you get it now? I loved him. He died. I died too. I grieved, just like I would have if you had died. It's the same now as it was 20 years ago. If you had died on that lake, I would have died too. Do you understand now? Richard looks a bit embarrassed, but replies, I guess on some level I do. I didn't mean it that way. I can be selfish too. We just touched on this today, but when you found out about Tim, I felt like I had to go through all the sorrow of his end of life all over again. I guess I still have feelings for him. I haven't thought of him in years, but I can still see his face. He'll always be in my memories. Now that you know, I have to relive all that pain again, and it's eliminating me. Can we let Dr. Brooks guide us through this next week? I can see it's going to be hard for both of us. Okay, Joan agrees softly, but get me a glass of wine before you go to bed. I need some time alone. Richard gets the wine, turns off the living room lights, and heads upstairs. At the top of the stairs, he hears sobbing from downstairs. He quietly closes his bedroom door. 8 weeks later, Joan finally lets her anger show. I can't talk to you tonight. You make me so mad I could strangle you. You wanted a divorce without even talking to me? Are you crazy? We've talked about everything since we were married, and at this crucial point you want to handle this alone? What are you thinking? I'm going to bed. Now it's Richard's turn to sit in the dark living room with a beer. He doesn't care much for wine. The next morning, some say the smell of brewing coffee can wake the dead. That's Richard's first thought as he wakes up. He opens one eye slightly and sees the living room ceiling. The smell of coffee is still there. He opens his other eye and turns his head toward the kitchen. He sees a tall woman in a bathrobe holding a steaming cup of coffee. Breakfast is almost ready. Go clean up. Go, Joan says firmly. Joan is the woman in the bathrobe that Richard sees. After all these years, she still looks like a goddess in the morning, voluptuous and earthy. His heart beats a little faster, and it's not because of the coffee. Richard sits up and accidentally knocks over the empty beer bottle. He heads to the bathroom, relieves himself, and washes up. In the mirror, he sees bloodshot eyes and the imprint of the couch cushion on his face. Neither looks good, but he goes back downstairs for breakfast anyway. After a delicious meal, one he didn't have to cook, he leans back and really looks at Joan for the first time that day. She, too, has bloodshot eyes. I'm sorry, Joan says quietly. I'm still struggling with seeing things from your perspective. We need to write that down for Dr. Brooks next time. Richard smiles, something he hasn't done much lately. That's okay. I struggle with it too. Sometimes when I say something, I don't think about how it'll sound to you or how it'll make you feel. I'm sorry too. He pauses. How about we have our conversation this morning? Wait a minute, Joan interrupts. What are you doing off work today? I took the day off because it's more important to be here and talk this out with you than to push papers at the lab. They can manage without me today. An hour later, they're sitting in the backyard with another cup of coffee, talking. Why did you ask Luke to draft divorce papers? Joan asks. I was so hurt and confused. I wasn't thinking straight. All I knew was that you cheated and I didn't want anything to do with you anymore. I've always believed, once a cheater, always a cheater. I didn't want to go through that again. Like I said, I wasn't thinking straight. But why didn't you want to talk to me? Maybe we could have worked it out, Joan presses. I know. If we had talked, I would have said things I'd regret. It would have hurt both of us, maybe beyond repair. I also knew that if we talked, I wouldn't understand anything you said. There was too much going on in my mind. Besides, I was hurt and thought if you suffered too, I'd feel better. But, by the way, I don't feel better. Joan sighs. That actually makes sense. I probably thought all those nasty things about myself too. We need to let Dr. Brooks guide us through this. We can't leave anything unsaid or unresolved. We have to be careful and take our time. Joan, can I ask you something off topic? Sure, anything. Did you ever think about leaving me while you were with him? Never. I loved you. I never thought about leaving you. You've always been my world. I wasn't going to give you up. I loved both of you. We haven't resolved that issue yet, but I could never have given up either of you. I would have died. It's still an open wound for me. I don't know if I'll ever resolve it. I may have to live with it as one of life's unanswered questions, but I'm glad you didn't want to leave me. Richard smiles faintly. Been there, done that, as they say. I understand. Now let's shut up and get some sun. You're too pale. It was a beautiful sunny day, and the Alexanders were outside, enjoying the sun. A few weeks later, after a therapy session, Richard says, Wow, that was eye-opening. Do we want to talk about it now or sleep on it? I'm still wired from the session. I say we talk now, but you look exhausted. I'm okay, Joan replies. It's just hard. Remembering everything and being completely open about Zex has always been difficult for me. Even saying head out loud is tough. I'm mentally exhausted, but we can still talk if you want. Tonight, though, I'll need something stronger than soda. Okay, you relax, and I'll get us something to drink. Richard says. He fetches a glass of wine for Joan and a soda for himself. When he returns to the living room, he sees Joan on the couch, her head back and eyes closed. For a moment, he considers quietly covering her with a blanket and going to bed. But she opens her eyes and gives him a faint, crooked smile. The same smile that first caught his attention in high school. "Okay, hun, where do you want to start?" Joan asks. "I'm not sure. How about explaining what you meant when you said he rocked your world differently from me? I always thought our Zek's life was good and that I rocked your world just fine, but evidently I didn't measure up." "It's not that you were worse or better than Tim," Joan explains. "When you and I made love, it was just making love. After Mark was born, we rarely went wild or tried new things. We were comfortable with what we did. We knew each other's every desire. We didn't need to experiment anymore. We had found what we liked and did it. Not out of boredom, but because it's what we wanted. With Tim, it was like exploring Zek's all over again. We found things we loved that were different from what you and I did. It's like we found our comfort zone. But you did things with him that you didn't do with me," Richard says, his voice pained. "No, not really. You and I tried everything," Joan replies, shaking her head. "But with Tim, we found different things we both loved that were different from you and me." "Yeah, I read that," Richard says bitterly. "Thanks for reminding me. I'm not trying to upset you. I'm just saying that when Tim and I made love, we had a different set of acts that turned us on. But in the end, we still made love. I never did anything with either of you that I didn't do with the other. If you were into something unusual, like public Zex, I'd probably try it and be into it because you were. Does that make sense?" "I guess," Richard mutters. "I don't know. I'm still struggling to get the image of you with another man out of my mind. I may never get over it. I just wish I didn't see that image every time I look at you. Now that you've told me all this, it's stuck in my mind. Just one more nail in my mental coffin." "Damn. I didn't mean to hurt you more than I already have. I'm just trying to be as open and honest as possible to help us heal. It hurts me to say these things out loud just as much as it hurts you to hear them." "We've got a long way to go," Richard sighs. "I know. I'm here whenever you're ready, but only when you're comfortable. I'll wait as long as it takes. I love you, and I always will." 6 weeks later, Dr. Brooks checks her appointment book and smiles. "The Alexanders are next. Today will be quite a surprise for them. I hope they're as prepared as I think they are." When Richard and Joan walk into the waiting room, holding hands and talking, Dr. Brooks takes it as a good sign. Once they're seated in their usual spots on the couch, she begins, "How are you both today? I don't think I have any unresolved issues from last time, so I'll just ask if you have anything you want to discuss. Richard, you've had to move past those images of Joan with someone else. I imagine they still pop up and are hard to get past. You both need to be patient and talk through things when they feel wrong. You've made a lot of progress." "Yeah, I hope so," Richard replies. "This past weekend was awkward," Joan adds. "We know what to expect, but we're still carrying baggage, trying not to trip over it." She looks directly at Richard. "We will get better, hon, I promise. I love you and will do whatever it takes to make you feel comfortable with me, with us. Nothing is more important to me than having you back with me every night. I've missed you more than you know. I need you, and I love you." Richard nods. "Just be patient. We've got some demons to conquer." After a long pause, Dr. Brooks gives them the news. "This will be our last session. You've come a long way since our first meeting, and I think it's time for you to go on your own. I'll always be here if you need me, but now the best therapy is for you two to figure out what's normal for you. You've learned a lot about yourselves and each other, some good and some not so good." Richard then turns to Joan, his voice steady. "Joan, I've loved you with all my heart, but unlike you, I only had you in my heart. I never divided my attention or loyalty. You've said you loved both of us, but that's where I fail to understand. How can you give your all to both of us? I'm your lawfully married husband. You promised to be loyal and forsake all others, but breaking that promise shows me you haven't given me your all. If I stay with you, I'll always be the man who wasn't fully loved by his wife. I accidentally found out about your relationship with Tim. You never told me how you felt. If you had, I would have divorced you, and the pain would have been less than what it is now. I'm not sure what shortcomings I had as a husband that led to this affair, but it's been a year of agony. I was put on this journey by the person I loved and trusted the most. I don't trust you anymore. I don't know how many more secrets I might uncover if I dig deeper. I know I'm not the only man in your heart, and that hurts. I can't live with that feeling for the rest of my life. Looking at you and knowing how you lied to me for so many years, making me live a dream that was rotten with deceit and betrayal. It's unbearable. So I'm left with no choice but to be on my own. I'll file for divorce tomorrow. We'll split everything 50-50 and move on. I won't hold any ill feelings toward you because when I leave this room today, I won't carry any feelings for you at all. You may contest the divorce, but I don't plan to stay with you. Since you didn't consider our marriage before starting your affair, I won't either. Divorced or not, that status won't hold me back. I'm mentally, emotionally, and spiritually divorced from you. Thank you, doctor, for the sessions. Now I don't care what Joan has to say. You've been paid and my therapy is over. He gets up, looks at Joan, who is crying, but says nothing. He walks out, feeling the fresh air on his face. It feels great. For the first time in ages, he feels relaxed. He feels free. Joan is served divorce papers the following week. Richard has already taken his half of the money, leaving only the house to divide. He moves into a new condo near his office. Joan tries to contact him, but he never answers her calls or messages. Their son tries to intervene, but Richard asks him, "What if, after years of bliss, you woke up in a nightmare? Would you still live in that nightmare?" His son stops asking after that. 2 years later, Richard is finally free of his marriage. Joan tried every tactic, but he paid no attention. She begged, threatened, and cried, but it didn't matter to him. At his age, finding a new partner seemed unlikely, but Richard found comfort in living with his 3 German shepherds. He knew for sure that they only loved him.
Welcome back to the Cheating Tales Lab. First of all, a huge thank you for helping us reach 5,000 subscribers. Thank you all for your amazing support. To celebrate, we're launching our second channel, Infidelity Tales Lab, where you'll get one-day early access to all our stories plus exclusive, original cheating wife stories you won't find anywhere else. You can subscribe now by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment, or simply search for Infidelity Tales Lab on YouTube. Don't miss out. Subscribe and listen to exclusive stories. You won't regret subscribing. Now let's begin the story. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the immaculate kitchen of the Clark residence as Nathan observed the caterers setting up for his son Spencer's graduation party. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with steel gray eyes and the composed demeanor that had served him well through countless surgeries, Nathan reached for his coffee while maintaining a careful watch on the scene unfolding before him. The head caterer approached him with a clipboard. "Dr. Clark, where would you like the seafood station?" "The west side of the pool area should work well," Nathan replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned him respect in both the operating room and boardroom. "Just ensure it's under the awning to avoid direct sunlight." Through the kitchen window, he caught sight of his wife Marilyn directing the decoration team. 25 years of marriage had taught him to read the subtle tells in her movements, the slightly too precise gestures, the artificial brightness of her smile. At 52, Marilyn still turned heads with her tennis-toned figure and carefully maintained appearance, but Nathan had long since learned to see past the polished surface. "Nathan?" Marilyn's voice carried that familiar edge of urgency as she swept into the kitchen, her designer sundress rustling. "Could you help with the decorations inside? The living room still needs attention." Before Nathan could respond, his brother Howard emerged from the pool area, his casual demeanor just a shade too calculated. "I've got the backyard handled," Howard added quickly, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Those string lights won't hang themselves." Nathan nodded, maintaining his neutral expression even as his hand brushed against the phone in his pocket. The device silently recorded, a practice he'd adopted over the past year on the advice of Clay Maloney, the ex-military security consultant who'd first raised concerns about irregular patterns in Marilyn's behavior and suspicious financial transactions. "Dr. Clark?" Sarah Chun, one of the nurses from his practice, approached with a stack of paperwork. "I hate to interrupt, but these surgical schedules need your approval before Monday." "Of course, Sarah." Nathan gestured toward the kitchen island, noting how Marilyn's smile tightened at the interruption. "Let's review them now." As Sarah spread out the documents, Nathan caught the flash of irritation that crossed Howard's face. His brother had always been the more personable one, content with his role as hospital administrator while Nathan pursued his surgical career. Now, Watching Howard's hand brush against Marilyn's arm in what might appear to be an innocent gesture, Nathan reflected on how that congeniality had served as the perfect cover. "Dad," Spencer's voice carried across the kitchen as he bounded in, all 6 feet of youthful energy barely contained in his graduation suit. "Can you help me with something?" "It's about the medical school application." Nathan studied his son's face, so like his own, or so he'd always thought. "What's on your mind?" "It's the personal statement," Spencer began, leading Nathan toward his study. "I want to mention the volunteer work at the hospital, but I'm not sure how to frame it." Through the study window, Nathan had a clear view of the pool area. He watched as Howard reappeared, moving with too much familiarity in a space that wasn't his home. The security cameras Clay had installed 6 months ago would be capturing every moment. "Spencer," Nathan said carefully, "why don't you tell me about the hospital volunteering?" "All of it." His son shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean?" "The hours you logged when I was in surgery. The time you spent with Uncle Howard." Spencer's phone buzzed, his girlfriend Katie's name flashing on the screen. "I should take this," he muttered, relief evident in his voice as he stepped out of the study. Nathan returned to the kitchen, timing his movements precisely. The caterers had moved outside, leaving the space momentarily empty. Through the window, he watched as Howard pulled Marilyn close behind a decorative trellis, their kiss speaking of years of practiced deception. Nathan's hand tightened on his coffee cup, but his expression remained impassive. 20 years of performing high-stakes surgery had taught him the value of steady hands and careful timing. Marilyn's laugh carried across the yard, sharp and triumphant. 20 years of family vacations, and you really thought we were just close in-laws," she was saying to Howard, unaware of Nathan's presence at the window. "The best cover is hiding in plain sight," Howard replied, his hand lingering on her waist. Nathan was always too busy saving lives to notice what was happening in his own home. They turned, finally spotting Nathan at the window. Instead of shame or guilt, Marilyn's expression showed only arrogant satisfaction. "Well," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the open window, "I suppose the charade can finally end. Even the kids call him Daddy when you're not around." "Nathan?" Spencer appeared beside Nathan, his face a mix of defiance and guilt. "Sorry, Dad, but we had to choose sides a long time ago. Uncle Howard was always there while you were at the hospital. He came to my games, helped with homework." Nathan smiled, reaching into his jacket pocket where Clay's USB drive sat heavy with evidence. "Interesting choice," he said quietly, his tone making Spencer take an involuntary step back. "Let's discuss your definition of family." "Oh, please," Marilyn scoffed, striding into the kitchen with Howard close behind. "Are we really going to have a scene at Spencer's graduation party? How typically dramatic of you, Nathan." "Dramatic?" Nathan's voice remained level as he turned to face them. "I'd say 20 years of systematic deception is rather dramatic, wouldn't you, Howard? Although I suppose managing 2 families must have required quite the performance." Howard's face reddened. "You don't know what you're talking about. You were never here, always at the hospital, always in surgery. Someone had to be there for Marilyn, for Spencer. Someone had to help themselves to my family, you mean?" Nathan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And my accounts? The offshore transfers were a nice touch. Did you think being hospital administrator meant I wouldn't notice the financial irregularities?" "You're delusional," Marilyn snapped, but her hand trembled as she reached for her wine glass. "Howard has been more of a husband and father than you ever were." "Has he?" Nathan removed his phone from his pocket, playing a recording. Howard's voice filled the kitchen, discussing account numbers and transfer dates with Marilyn. Spencer's face paled. "Mom? What's he talking about?" "Your mother and uncle have been very busy," Nathan said calmly. "But then, you've known that for years, haven't you, Spencer? Those summer internships at the hospital weren't just about padding your medical school application." "You bastard," Howard snarled, taking a step forward. "You've been spying on us?" "Gathering evidence," Nathan corrected. "There's a difference. Though I suppose ethics was never your strong suit, brother." Marilyn's laugh turned bitter. "And what are you going to do with this supposed evidence? Ruin your son's graduation party? Destroy our family's reputation?" "Our family?" Nathan's voice carried a dangerous edge. No, Marilyn. This stopped being our family a long time ago. You made your choice. He turned to Spencer. And so did you. Dad, please, Spencer began. But Nathan cut him off. Save it. The party's over. Nathan moved toward the door, his voice carrying clearly. Enjoy your celebration. Tomorrow, we begin discussing consequences. The silence that followed him was broken only by the sound of Marilyn's wine glass shattering against the kitchen floor. Nathan walked to his car, his steps measured and calm. In his pocket, his phone continued recording, capturing the panicked conversation that erupted behind him. Clay was waiting in a black SUV across the street, his military training evident in his alert posture. Everything recorded. Dr. Clark? Every word. Nathan slid into the passenger seat. Contact Morrison. Tell him to prepare the legal documents for tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. sharp, Clay confirmed, starting the engine. The security team will have the house monitored all night. Nathan nodded, watching through the tinted windows as Howard emerged from the house, gesturing angrily as he spoke on his phone. 20 years of betrayal would end with precision timing, just like every surgery Nathan had ever performed. One more thing, Nathan added as they pulled away from the curb. Contact the hospital board. I think it's time for an emergency meeting about financial irregularities in the administration. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a sharp contrast to the storm about to break. Nathan arrived at precisely 8 a.m., Morrison's leather briefcase in one hand and Clay's USB drive in the other. Marilyn answered the door in her silk robe, her careful makeup not quite hiding the signs of a sleepless night. What's this? Her hand trembled as she took the envelope Nathan held out. Divorce papers, he replied calmly, sliding the USB drive across the kitchen counter. And this contains 20 years of surveillance footage, phone recordings, and bank transfers. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the money moving to offshore accounts? You can't prove anything, Marilyn snapped, but her face had gone pale as she stared at the drive. Every family vacation, every business trip with Howard, Spencer's college fund transfers. It's all there. Nathan stood, straightening his suit jacket. You have 1 hour to leave the house. The locks change at 9. You can't do this. Marilyn's voice rose. This is my home. Was your home? Nathan corrected. Morrison will explain the temporary restraining order. I'd suggest reading it carefully, especially the part about electronic communications and financial transactions. I'll fight you, she hissed. Howard and I both will. You'll lose everything. Nathan paused at the door, looking back at the woman he'd once loved. No, Marilyn, you already lost everything. You just didn't know it until now. As he walked to his car, Nathan heard Marilyn's angry sobs through the open window, but his steps didn't falter. In the surgical theater, hesitation meant death. In life, he'd learned, it meant something worse, the slow death of dignity and self-respect. His phone buzzed, a text from Clay confirming that Howard had just received similar papers at his home. Nathan smiled as he started his car. The first incision had been made. Now it was time to excise the cancer that had grown in his life, with the same precision he'd used to save countless patients. The war was just beginning, but Nathan Clark had never lost a battle he was prepared for. And he'd been preparing for this one for a very long time. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across Ian McKinney's polished conference table as Howard paced the room. 1 week had passed since Nathan's devastating revelation, and the hospital administrator's usually confident demeanor had given way to barely contained panic. He is everything, Howard muttered, running his hands through his disheveled hair. The recordings, the transfers. Sit down, McKinney commanded, his reputation for aggressive divorce tactics evident in his shark-like smile. This isn't my first case involving surveillance. Your brother may think he's clever, but you don't know Nathan, Marilyn interrupted, her designer outfit failing to hide the strain of the past week. He doesn't make moves unless he's certain of the outcome. McKinney leaned forward, his expensive suit creaking. Then we change the game. Attack his reputation, his credibility. The controlling husband, obsessed with surveillance, fabricating evidence out of paranoia. The hospital board, Howard's eyes lit up. I've built relationships there for years. Nathan's always been the outsider, focused on his surgeries. Perfect. McKinney began typing on his laptop. I'll draft a statement suggesting psychological evaluation. Question his fitness to practice. Marilyn's laugh held a bitter edge. Nathan, unfit? He's performed more successful surgeries than any other doctor in the state. Success can feed obsession, McKinney countered. Howard, set up a board meeting. Make it seem like you're concerned about your brother's mental state. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following day. Howard stood before the gathered members, his performance carefully calibrated to project worried sincerity. Nathan's always been obsessed with control, Howard told the assembled board members, his voice carrying just the right note of reluctant concern. These accusations, they're fabrications born from his inability to handle Marilyn's independence. Dr. Wade Rhodes, the board chairman who'd been quietly supporting Howard's administrative decisions for years, nodded sympathetically. These are serious concerns, Howard. Perhaps a mandatory leave of absence. The boardroom door opened. Nathan walked in, Clay Maloney's imposing figure following with a laptop. Perfect timing. Nathan's voice cut through the murmurs. I was hoping to discuss some financial irregularities myself. Howard's face paled. This is a closed meeting. About my mental health? Nathan smiled, the expression reminiscent of a surgeon before making the first incision. Interesting timing, considering what Clay found in the hospital's auxiliary accounts. Clay connected the laptop to the presentation screen. Numbers began scrolling, followed by recordings. Howard's voice filled the room, discussing fund transfers with Wade Rhodes. Just move it through the equipment budget, Howard was saying. Nathan's too busy in surgery to notice. Rhodes' face turned ashen as his own voice appeared. The board audit won't catch it if we... I think, Nathan said into the silence that followed. We should discuss a different kind of leave of absence. The next few weeks unfolded like a carefully orchestrated surgery. Each revelation was timed for maximum impact, each piece of evidence deployed with precision. During a particularly tense deposition, Spencer sat across from Nathan, his expensive shirt wrinkled from hours of questioning. You don't understand, Dad, Spencer pleaded, his facade of defiance cracking. Mom and Uncle Howard said you'd destroy everyone if you ever found out. They said you were dangerous. Nathan studied the young man he'd raised, seeing now the subtle resemblances to Howard that he'd overlooked for years. No, son, they were the dangerous ones, and you chose their side. They needed help hiding the transfers, Spencer continued, his voice small. Just small things at first, when I was 15. Running errands, delivering documents. Fraud doesn't start with large crimes, Nathan replied, his tone clinical. It starts with small betrayals, justified by convenient lies. The legal proceedings revealed layers of deception that even Nathan hadn't anticipated. Marilyn had been systematically draining accounts since Spencer's 10th birthday. Howard had used his position as hospital administrator to cover financial irregularities that went beyond their affair. The evidence mounted, each revelation more damning than the last. During a settlement negotiation, Marilyn's mask of sophistication finally cracked. You're enjoying this, she spat across the conference table. Destroying everything we built. Everything you stole, Nathan corrected calmly. There's a difference. We had a life before you became obsessed with your career, she countered. Howard was there when you were playing hero in the operating room. Playing hero? Nathan's laugh held no humor. While I was saving lives, you were stealing from those same patients. The foundation funds, Marilyn. Did you think I wouldn't find those transfers? Howard slammed his hand on the table. You self-righteous bastard. You think you're better than everyone else, up in your surgical tower. Better?
No.
Nathan sliding a document across the table. Just more thorough. This is a complete audit of the hospital's charitable foundation. The board received a copy this morning. Howard's face went from red to white as he scanned the pages. You can't. The medical board received it too, Nathan continued. They're particularly interested in the cancer research funds. Tell me, Howard, how many trials were delayed because you diverted their funding? The investigation moved quickly after that. Howard's medical license was suspended pending a full review. Marilyn's carefully cultivated social circle evaporated as evidence of her manipulations became public. Spencer, his college fund frozen due to evidence of his involvement in the financial fraud, watched his carefully planned future crumble. Nathan's divorce proceedings moved with the same precision he brought to his surgeries. Each attempt by Marilyn to claim assets was met with documented evidence of her deception. Howard's efforts to maintain his position at the hospital collapsed under the weight of forensic accounting. "You could show some mercy," Howard attempted during their final confrontation at the hospital. "We're still brothers." Nathan's voice could have frosted glass. "You betrayed my trust, stole from my patients, and corrupted my son. Biology doesn't excuse that." "The patients were never at risk," Howard protested weakly. "The funds were always." 6 months, Nathan cut him off. 6 months of delayed cancer trials because you diverted their funding. How many lives were affected by those delays, Howard? The hospital board's decision was unanimous. Howard's termination was followed by a referral to the state medical board for ethics violations. His career in hospital administration was effectively over. Marilyn's attempts to salvage her reputation fared no better. Her friends, many of them hospital board members' wives, turned their backs as evidence emerged of her systematic manipulation. "I hear she tried to join the country club committee," Nathan overheard one nurse telling another. "They wouldn't even take her application. After what she did to those charity funds," the second nurse replied. "She's lucky she's not in jail." The final blow came when Nathan's lawyers revealed the extent of Spencer's involvement. The trust fund transfers, the falsified volunteer hours, the years of small betrayals that had grown into significant fraud. "He was just a kid when they started grooming him," Clay observed during one of their strategy sessions. "Old enough to know right from wrong," Nathan replied, reviewing another set of documents. "Old enough to make choices." Within months, the war Nathan had prepared for was effectively over. Howard's medical license suspension was heading toward permanent revocation. Marilyn's divorce settlement left her with only what she'd brought into the marriage, which proved to be far less than she'd claimed. As Nathan sat in his office, reviewing the final settlement documents, he reflected on the precision with which everything had unfolded. Like a complex surgery, each step had been planned, each potential complication anticipated. His phone buzzed, a message from Clay about Howard's latest desperate attempt to salvage his career. "Trying to claim rights to your research patents," the message read. "Should I release the evidence about his attempted data theft?" Nathan smiled, thinking of the backup files he'd maintained for years, documenting every suspicious access to his research databases. "Release everything," he typed back. "It's time to close this procedure." The sun was setting over the city as Nathan signed the final divorce decree. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he could appreciate the completeness of the operation he'd just concluded. Some cancers required aggressive treatment, and he'd just excised one from his life with surgical precision. 3 years passed like well-planned surgical procedures, precise, methodical, and with predictable outcomes. Nathan Clark stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse overlooking the city, watching the sunset paint the skyline in shades of amber. His reflection showed a man who had emerged stronger from betrayal, his steel-gray hair now a distinguished silver at the temples, his posture that of someone who commanded respect rather than demanded it. The notification sound from his laptop drew his attention back to his desk, where the quarterly reports from his private practice showed numbers that would make any hospital administrator envious. Not that Howard would know. Nathan's former brother now worked at a small-town clinic in Nebraska, his medical career a shadow of its former glory. "Dr. Clark?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Dr. Hannah Reynolds is here for your 6 p.m. meeting." Nathan smiled, a genuine expression that had become more frequent in recent months. "Send her in, Sarah." Hannah entered with the confident stride of someone who spent their days making split-second decisions in the trauma unit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her scrubs replaced by casual business attire that spoke of a woman who understood both operating rooms and boardrooms. "Quarterly numbers look good," she noted, glancing at his screen, "though I'm more interested in dinner. I've got an hour before I'm back on call." Their relationship had developed naturally over the past year, built on shared understanding of dedication and integrity. Hannah had been chief of trauma surgery when the truth about Howard's mismanagement of hospital funds came to light. "Italian?" Nathan suggested, reaching for his jacket. There's a new place downtown that... His phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender's name made him pause. Spencer Clark. I need to see you. It's important. Hannah read the message over his shoulder, her expression concerned. Are you going to respond? Yes, Nathan replied, his voice neutral. This was inevitable. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Nathan sat behind his desk, watching Spencer approach through the office windows. His once son looked older than his 21 years, the expensive clothes replaced by worn jeans and a shabby jacket. I need help with college tuition, Spencer began without preamble, dropping into the chair across from Nathan. Mom and Howard can't. Before you continue, Nathan interrupted. Opening his desk drawer to remove 2 sealed envelopes. Read these. Spencer's hands trembled slightly as he opened the first envelope. The DNA test results were clear, clinical in their devastation. The second envelope contained transcripts, years of recorded conversations between Spencer, Howard, and Marilyn, plotting their deceptions. Howard is your biological father, Nathan said quietly, watching the color drain from Spencer's face. Has been since before you were born. That's why you had to choose sides. You were always on his side. Dad. Spencer's face crumpled, the arrogance of graduation day long gone. I'm not your dad. I never was. That was your first betrayal, letting me believe I was. We didn't. I didn't know until... Until when? Nathan's voice remained steady. When did you start helping them hide evidence? 15. Wasn't it? Old enough to know right from wrong. Spencer slumped in his chair. Mom said you'd help with tuition. Said you wouldn't want your reputation damaged by having your son drop out of college. My reputation? Nathan's laugh held no warmth. My reputation is built on integrity, Spencer. Something you, Howard, and Marilyn never understood. Howard lost everything, Spencer protested. The clinic barely pays enough for them to survive. Mom had to sell her jewelry just... Actions have consequences. Nathan cut him off. Your mother's social circle evaporated because she stole from their charity foundations. Howard's medical license was suspended because he diverted cancer research funds. Your college fund was frozen because you helped them hide the evidence. These aren't tragedies, Spencer. They're justice. So that's it? You're just going to let your... Spencer caught himself. Let me drop out of college? Nathan reached for another folder. These are the names of every cancer patient whose treatment was delayed because Howard diverted research funds. Read them. Understand what your real father did to people who trusted him with their lives. Spencer's hands shook as he scanned the list. I didn't know. You knew enough, Nathan replied. Now you know more. Consider it your final lesson from me. As Spencer left the office, Nathan felt no remorse. His phone buzzed with a message from Hannah about dinner plans. On his desk, a photo of his new charitable foundation's first scholarship recipients, all children of cancer patients, reminded him that family wasn't always about blood. That evening, over dinner at their favorite restaurant, Hannah watched him with understanding eyes. Spencer came by the trauma unit today, she said. Asked if I could talk to you about reconsidering. And I told him that integrity isn't negotiable. Hannah's smile was fierce. He didn't like that answer. Nathan nodded, appreciating once again how well she understood him. Their relationship had grown from mutual respect into something deeper, built on shared values rather than decades of lies. The next morning brought news that Howard and Marilyn had made one final attempt to claim part of Nathan's new medical patents. The attempt failed spectacularly when Nathan's lawyers revealed evidence of Howard's previous attempts to steal research data. They never learn, Clay Maloney commented, dropping the legal documents on Nathan's desk. Still trying to take what isn't theirs. Old habits, Nathan replied, signing the final restraining order that would prevent any future contact. How's the foundation doing? First round of scholarships went out last week. The board's impressed with how you've turned Howard's fraud into something positive. Nathan looked out over the city he now called home. The view from his office reminded him of how far he'd come from that afternoon by the pool, watching his world unravel. He'd lost a family built on lies but gained something more valuable, the truth about loyalty and the strength to stand alone rather than compromise his principles. Later that evening, dining with Hannah at his penthouse, Nathan realized something profound. She was discussing a complicated trauma case, her passion for saving lives matching his own dedication to his patients. Here was someone who understood that sometimes the best revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about rebuilding something stronger from the ashes of betrayal. "You're quiet tonight," Hannah observed, pouring another glass of wine. "Just thinking about choices," Nathan replied. "And consequences. Regrets?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No," Nathan said firmly, "just appreciation for truth. It's cleaner than comfortable lies." His phone buzzed one final time, a notification that Howard's attempt to appeal his license suspension had been denied. Nathan silenced the phone without reading the full message. Some chapters needed to stay closed. The city lights sparkled below, a testament to life moving forward. Nathan had rebuilt his world with the same precision he brought to his surgeries, cutting out the cancer of betrayal and ensuring it could never grow back. The emptiness of loss had been filled with something better: integrity, purpose, and the knowledge that sometimes the strongest families were the ones you chose, not the ones you were born into. As Hannah discussed plans for expanding the Foundation's scholarship program, Nathan felt the last pieces of his old life fade into irrelevance. He had excised the cancer of betrayal from his life with surgical precision, and in its place, he had built something far more valuable: a life founded on truth, supported by integrity, and enriched by genuine connections. The price of betrayal had been high, but the rewards of honesty were proving to be worth every painful incision along the way. Epilogue: 5 years after the reckoning. The small-town clinic in Nebraska where Howard now worked barely resembled the prestigious hospital he once administered. The peeling paint and outdated equipment served as daily reminders of his fall from grace. At 58, his once commanding presence had deteriorated into that of a bitter man who treated routine cases of flu and minor injuries. "Dr. Andrews, your next patient is waiting," the receptionist called out, deliberately using Howard's mother's maiden name. After the scandal, he'd been forced to change it. The Clark name carried too much weight in medical circles, all of it negative. His office, a cramped room with fluorescent lighting, contained newspaper clippings he obsessively collected about Nathan's continued success. The most recent showed Nathan receiving a humanitarian award for his charitable foundation's work in providing medical care to underprivileged children. Marilyn, now showing every day of her 55 years, worked as a receptionist at a local dentist's office. Her designer clothes had been replaced by discount store finds, her once perfect manicures now chipped and self-maintained. The other wives in town whispered about her past, the story of her betrayal having followed them even to this remote corner of Nebraska. "Did you see the society pages?" Marilyn asked Howard that evening in their rented 2-bedroom apartment. "Nathan and Hannah's foundation just opened another free clinic. They're expecting their first child." Howard's hand trembled as he poured himself another drink. "Leave it alone, Marilyn." But she couldn't. The laptop screen showed photos from a recent charity gala. Nathan distinguished in a tuxedo, Hannah elegantly showing her pregnancy. The article detailed their work: 3 free clinics, a scholarship program for medical students from underprivileged backgrounds, and a research foundation focusing on pediatric cancer, funded partially by the settlement money from Howard's fraud case. Their own son, Spencer, had eventually completed his community college degree through night classes while working as a pharmacy technician. He tried reaching out to Nathan once more 2 years ago, sending a congratulatory email when Nathan and Hannah's wedding was announced. The email bounced back. Nathan's lawyers maintained a strict no-contact policy. Clay Maloney, whose security firm now handled all of Nathan's charitable organizations, had established a comprehensive monitoring system. Any attempts by Howard, Marilyn, or Spencer to approach Nathan or his new family resulted in immediate legal consequences. "Remember Sandra's wedding invitation?" Marilyn muttered, referring to her former best friend. The invitation had been returned unopened. Her once vast social circle had contracted to a few other disgraced individuals they'd met in Nebraska. Howard's ex-wife Linda had thrived after their divorce. She'd used her settlement to open a successful wellness center, her social media showing frequent trips to Europe and a new husband who looked at her with genuine devotion. She'd even been invited to Nathan and Hannah's wedding. The hospital board chairman, Wade Rhodes, had resigned in disgrace after Nathan's evidence exposed the full extent of the financial fraud. He occasionally saw Howard at medical conferences for small regional clinics, both men avoiding eye contact, their name tags displaying different surnames than the ones they'd worn in their prime. Sarachin, the nurse who'd worked with Nathan for years, had been promoted to chief nursing officer at his private practice. She took particular satisfaction in returning any messages from Howard or Marilyn with a form letter citing the no-contact policy. "We should never have tried to claim those patents," Marilyn said, closing the laptop. Their last attempt to grab at Nathan's success had resulted in their lawyer dropping them as clients and another hefty fine they were still paying off. Howard's medical license remained restricted, requiring annual reviews and limiting the procedures he could perform. The small-town clinic tolerated him because they were desperately understaffed, but his colleagues maintained a professional distance, the whispers about his past following him through the corridors. Meanwhile, Nathan and Hannah's life exemplified everything Howard and Marilyn had lost. Their private practice had expanded to 3 locations, each specializing in different aspects of surgery and trauma care. The charitable foundation, named after one of the cancer patients whose treatment had been delayed by Howard's fraud, provided hope to families facing medical crises. Clay's security reports, which he still maintained out of professional thoroughness, painted a pathetic picture of the conspirators' lives. Spencer worked double shifts to afford a small apartment, his dreams of medical school permanently shattered. He'd tried dating, but background checks by potential in-laws inevitably uncovered his past, ending relationships before they could develop. Marilyn's attempts to maintain appearances grew more desperate each year. Her hair dye couldn't quite cover the gray. Her makeup couldn't hide the bitter lines around her mouth. The local society wives excluded her from their events, her past making her a liability to their reputations. The final insult had come when Howard's mother changed her will before passing away, leaving her estate to a medical scholarship fund administered by Nathan's foundation. She'd included a letter, made public as part of the bequest, expressing her shame at Howard's actions and her hope that Nathan's work would help repair some of the damage her son had caused. Nathan and Hannah welcomed their daughter, Grace Integrity Clark, in the spring. The birth announcement in the medical journal included a note about a new pediatric wing being opened in her honor. Howard saw the announcement during his lunch break, his hands shaking so badly he spilled coffee on his worn dress shirt. The contrast between the lives they'd chosen could not have been starker. Nathan had built his success on integrity and dedication, while Howard and Marilyn's betrayal had earned them a harvest of consequences they couldn't escape. Every day brought fresh reminders of their fall. Rejected credit cards, unanswered social invitations, professional doors firmly closed. Clay's latest security report sat on Nathan's desk, untouched. He no longer needed to read about their struggles. His focus remained on the future, the expanding medical practice, the growing foundation, his new family built on trust rather than lies. The price of betrayal had been high, but only for those who had chosen to betray. Nathan's new life stood as testament to the power of integrity, while Howard and Marilyn's served as a cautionary tale whispered in hospital corridors and country club lounges. Some choices carry consequences that last a lifetime. In the end, their greatest punishment wasn't the loss of money or status. It was having to watch from a distance as Nathan built something far greater than what they had tried to steal, knowing they had no one to blame but themselves.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.